Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the romantic tapestry-woven veil of the Middle Ages and taking a long, hard look at why you'd most definitely regret being born back then. Imagine, just for a moment, you're not nestled in your comfy bed, but instead you're about to pop into existence in a world lit by flickering tallow candles, where the night air carries the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something vaguely unsanitary. It's a world of stark contrasts, deep faith, and even deeper dangers. Honestly, you probably won't survive this, or at least not your first year. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps the channel out. Oh, and I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't choose the moment, of course. You just arrive. And your arrival isn't into a sterile, brightly lit hospital room with beeping machines and a team of medical professionals. No, you're likely making your grand entrance in a small, probably dark and almost certainly cold hut. The floor is packed earth, perhaps strewn with rushes that haven't been changed in a while, meaning they're less freshly scented and more mulchy and vaguely terrifying. Your mother, poor woman, is attended by a local midwife. She's probably a figure of immense experience, but her knowledge is a tapestry woven from tradition, herbal lore, and a fair bit of superstition. Think less licensed medical practitioner, and more well-meaning but underqualified aunt who once read a pamphlet on, birthing. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke from the central hearth, a fire that's essential for warmth but also fills the single room with a constant haze that stings your brand new eyes. There might be the scent of herbs, perhaps some pungent brew simmering to supposedly ease the labour or ward off evil spirits, and beneath it all, the raw metallic scent of birth itself. You hear your mother's cries, the hushed urgent whispers of the midwife, perhaps the fervent prayers of your father if he's even allowed in the room, which isn't always a given, and then you're out. A sudden, shocking explosion of cold air against your wet skin. There's no gentle warming lamp here. You're probably wiped down with a rough linen cloth if you're lucky. The concept of germ theory is centuries away, so hygiene is, let's call it rudimentary. The midwife's hands, which have likely tended to animals, fields, and countless other unwashed things, are now handling your fragile newborn body. Sepsis, for both mother and child, is an ever-present, unseen predator. Your first major hurdle, before you've even had a chance to figure out what lungs are for, is simply surviving the birth itself. Maternal mortality rates are terrifyingly high. Your mother has just run a life-threatening marathon. But this story is about you, and for you, the newborn, the odds are stacked like a wobbly Jenga tower in an earthquake. It's a stark historical fact that infant mortality was appallingly common. Some studies suggest that as many as 1 in 3, or even up to half of all children, didn't live to see their first birthday. Imagine a world where looking at a newborn baby is tinged with the heavy knowledge that their presence is heartbreakingly precarious. Once you've taken that first gulp of smoky air, you're quickly swaddled. Not in soft, breathable cotton, but in tight bands of linen or wool. The idea is to keep your limbs straight, to help them grow properly, or so the theory goes. In reality, it means you're trussed up like a tiny helpless sausage, sometimes for hours on end, unable to move much at all. This practice, while intended to protect, could lead to its own set of problems, from circulation issues to skin rashes in your rarely changed bindings. And speaking of changing, diapers as we know them are a distant dream. You're wrapped in cloth, and when it's soiled it might be rinsed, or it might just be dried and reused. The constant dampness and irritation would be your unwelcome companions. Your first meal, assuming your mother has survived the birth and is well enough, you'll be put to her breast. Breast milk is of course the perfect food, but if your mother is malnourished, exhausted or ill, her milk supply might be insufficient or compromised. And if she doesn't survive, or can't feed you, your options become grim. A wet nurse might be found, but that introduces a whole new lottery. Is she healthy? Is her own child thriving? Will her milk agree with you? Historians still argue whether the practice of wet nursing, particularly for noble families who could afford it, significantly improved an infant's chances or simply outsourced the risk. For poorer families, if mother's milk wasn't available, you might be fed pap. A concoction of bread soaked in water, milk, often animal milk and not pasteurised obviously, or weak ale. Yes, ale. It's not exactly superfood and it's a prime candidate for contamination. Then there are the diseases, the invisible armies waiting to attack your undefended system. Common childhood illnesses that we now vaccinate against. Measles, mumps, rubella, whooping cough are rampant and deadly. A simple cold could escalate to pneumonia with frightening speed. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox. The list of potential killers is long and terrifying. Clean water is a luxury few enjoy, so waterborne diseases are rife. Your tiny body, with its undeveloped immune system, is a walking invitation for every passing pathogen. And let's not forget the less scientific, but equally potent, fears of the age. What if you're a colicky baby, or cry incessantly? What if you're small, or have a visible birth defect? A rather quirky, though tragic tidbit from the era is the pervasive belief in changelings. If a baby was sickly, didn't thrive, or seemed somehow unnatural, it might be suspected that fairies had stolen the human child and left a fairy imposter in its place. Such unfortunate infants could be neglected, exposed to the elements, or subjected to folk rituals designed to drive the fairy away. Rituals that no sane parent today would ever dream of. Imagine your parents looking at you with suspicion rather than pure adoration, simply because you've got a nasty case of baby acne and haven't stopped wailing for 3 days straight. Even the act of baptism, which would happen very quickly after your birth, often within days if not hours, highlights this fragility. The urgency wasn't just for spiritual well-being, but because of the terrifyingly high chance you wouldn't last long. Dying unbaptized meant your soul was in limbo, a concept that weighed heavily on medieval minds. So, you'd be whisked off to the church, plunged into what was probably not very warm, nor particularly clean, holy water. Another opportunity for a good chill or a new infection. Hooray. So, you're born into a cold, smoky, unhygienic world, swaddled tightly, fed precariously, and surrounded by a miasma of potential diseases and superstitious fears. Your first few months are a desperate gamble. Every sunrise you greet is a small victory. If you make it through that first winter, if you survive the weaning process onto solid, often questionable foods, if you dodge the myriad infections that fell other infants like tiny flowers in a hailstorm, then you've achieved something truly remarkable. You've survived your first year. Your birthday celebration, if acknowledged at all, wouldn't involve a cake or presents. It would be more of a quiet sigh of relief from your parents, a silent prayer of thanks. Huzzah, the little one's not dead yet. Past the, well, probably still questionable ale. Because even if you've made it this far, the challenges are far from over. They're just changing shape. So, you've done it. Against considerable odds, you've managed to cling to life for a whole year, maybe even 2 or 3. You've navigated the treacherous waters of infancy, dodged the grim reaper who seemed to be lurking around every damp corner and unwashed hand. You can toddle now, perhaps even string a few words together. Your parents, while still probably not showering you with overt displays of affection in the modern sense, infant loss was too common for such emotional investment to be universally wise, are likely starting to see you less as a fragile question mark and more as, well, a future labourer. Because childhood, as you might romantically envision it, a sun-drenched meadow of carefree play, endless curiosity and a minimal responsibility, is a luxury that simply doesn't exist for most in this era. Forget finger painting and learning your ABCs with brightly coloured blocks. Your formative years are about to be very, very practical. By the time you reach the ripe old age of 7, an age where a child today might be mastering long division, or begging for the latest video game, your own childhood is essentially over. You're now considered capable of contributing to the household economy. There's no gentle transition, no easing into it. One day you're mostly underfoot, perhaps chasing chickens or making mud pies, which given the general sanitation were probably more authentic than you'd like. And the next, you're handed your first set of responsibilities. And these aren't take out the trash or make your bed kinds of chores. This is real work, often demanding, sometimes dangerous, and always, always there. If you're born into a peasant family, which is statistically the most likely scenario, your days will now be filled with tasks suited to your small stature, but vital to the family's survival. You'll be out in the fields, perhaps from dawn till dusk alongside your parents and older siblings. Your little hands might be perfect for weeding between rows of crops, a back-breaking task that leaves your knees raw and your fingers sore. Or you could be a human scarecrow, spending endless, monotonous hours in the fields, shouting and waving your arms to frighten birds away from the precious grain. Sounds thrilling, doesn't it? Like a live-action, incredibly boring version of Angry Birds. Only you're Syust, the underpaid intern. You'll help with cleaning after the harvest, scrounging for every last stalk of wheat or barley left behind, because every single grain counts. You might be put in charge of tending to the family's livestock, a pig perhaps, or a few geese. This isn't just a case of scattering some feed. You'll need to lead them to pasture, protect them from predators, both animal and human as theft was common, and ensure they don't wander off. A lost pig could mean the difference between eating meat that winter or going without. The responsibility, even for a young child, is immense. And animals, as any farmer will tell you, can be unpredictable and dangerous. A kick from an ox, a bite from a scared dog, or being trampled by a spooked sheep could lead to serious injury, and remember that high-tech medical care you don't have. If you're a girl, your tasks will likely lean more towards domestic duties, though field work is rarely off the table for anyone. You'll learn to spin wool or flax into thread, a never-ending task essential for making clothes. You'll help with cooking over an open fire, fetching water from the well or stream, a physically demanding job carrying heavy buckets, minding even younger siblings, and trying to keep the small, probably one-room hovel passably clean amidst the smoke and dirt. The soft-historical fact is that children were integrated into the adult world of work from a very early age, typically around 7. Performing tasks commensurate with their physical abilities, but essential to the family unit's survival. Now, if you happen to be born into an artisan family in a burgeoning town, your path is slightly different, but no less demanding. Around the age of 7 or a little older, you might be apprenticed. This means you're sent to live with a master craftsman, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a weaver, a baker, to learn their trade. It sounds like a good opportunity, and in some ways it is, but the reality can be harsh. You're essentially an unpaid servant for many years, performing the most menial tasks, sweeping the workshop, running errands, cleaning tools, and enduring the master's temper. The hours are long, the discipline often strict, and physical punishment for mistakes is common. You might sleep on a pallet in the workshop, cold and lonely, far from your family. Historians still argue whether the medieval apprenticeship system was primarily a mode of education or a form of indentured servitude for children. It was likely a bit of both, with the quality of the experience varying wildly depending on the master's temperament and the specific trade. Even noble children, who you might think had it easy, weren't exactly lolling about eating peeled grapes. Their work was different, geared towards their future roles in society. A young noble boy would be sent to another noble household to serve as a page, learning courtly manners, how to handle horses and weapons, and the complex rules of chivalry. It was a rigorous training, and by his early teens he'd likely be a squire, directly serving a knight, a role that involved a lot of armour polishing and very real danger in tournaments or actual battle. Noble girls were also often fostered in other households, learning the skills needed to manage a large estate, needlework, perhaps some music or dancing, and, most importantly, how to be a dutiful and advantageous wife, as their marriages were often political and economic alliances arranged, when they were still quite young. Playtime was structured, if it existed at all, and always with an eye towards future responsibilities. The concept of childhood innocence as a distinct, protected phase of life is a relatively modern invention. In medieval art, for instance, children are often depicted as miniature adults, dressed in smaller versions of adult clothing, with adult-like proportions and expressions. A quirky and somewhat revealing tidbit is that many toys of the era, like miniature tools or spinning tops, often mimicked adult activities or helped develop skills needed for adult work. There wasn't the same sentimental attachment to childhood as a separate, carefree world. You were simply a smaller, less experienced version of an adult, and the sooner you could pull your weight, the better. Forget about formal schooling unless you are exceptionally lucky and destined for the church, or come from a particularly wealthy and enlightened noble or merchant family. For the vast majority, literacy is an unattainable dream. Knowledge is passed down orally, through stories, songs, and practical instruction. Your education is the education of survival, of craft, of societal expectation. There are no summer holidays, no sick days unless you're genuinely at death's door, and even then you might be expected to contribute from your sickbed. You work, day in, day out. Through the cold winters and the hot summers, your body, still growing, is subjected to strains and stresses that can lead to chronic pain or injury later in life, assuming you make it that far. Imagine your 7-year-old self trudging off to a 14-hour workday in the fields, knowing that this is your life, stretching ahead of you for decades. Makes you appreciate that slightly boring math class, doesn't it? Or at least, it should make you glad you're not trying to scare crows for a living while your own stomach rumbles with hunger. One particularly bad day might involve a runaway pig, a scolding from your father, and the deep, abiding fear that you'll never quite measure up. And this is just the start of your working life. Alright, so you've somehow managed to survive infancy, and you've been unceremoniously catapulted into the world of adult labour, before you've even lost all your baby teeth. You're working hard, probably from sunup to sundown, your small hands already calloused, your back already aching. What fuels this relentless toil? What culinary delights await you after a long day of scaring birds, fetching water, or scrubbing your master's chamber pot? Well, prepare to have your gastronomic expectations adjusted dramatically. Your daily meals in medieval times, especially if you're part of the vast peasant majority, are going to be bland, often scarce, and occasionally deeply questionable in origin and freshness. Let's start with the absolute staple, the cornerstone of your diet, bread. But forget your fluffy artisanal sourdough or your pre-sliced whole wheat loaf. The bread you're eating is likely dark, dense and coarse, made from rye, barley or oats, rather than the more expensive and finer wheat, which was often reserved for the wealthy or for paying feudal dues. This bread would be gritty, not just from the coarsely ground flour, often ground at the Lord's mill for a fee of course, but sometimes from actual grit from the millstones. You might even find the odd mouse dropping if the storage wasn't up to snuff. Bonus protein, perhaps. It would be baked in communal ovens or on a hearthstone, and it would need to last. Stale bread wasn't a problem to be solved with a toaster. It was just Tuesday's bread. You dip it in whatever liquid was available to make it chewable. The next major component of your diet is something generally termed pottage. This is essentially a thick stew or porridge, the medieval equivalent of a whatever's in the fridge meal, except your fridge is a small garden patch, and whatever you could forage or scrounge. The base would be grains, oats, barley, simmered for hours with whatever vegetables were in season. Think onions, leeks, cabbage, peas and beans. Lots and lots of beans. They were a cheap source of protein, but let's just say the air in your one-room hovel might have been a bit fragrant. Herbs from the garden or foraged from the hedgerows might be added for flavour, but exotic spices? Those were a king's ransom, far beyond your reach. Salt was available, but it was a valuable commodity, carefully controlled and sometimes taxed so it wouldn't be used lavishly. Imagine a perpetually simmering pot over the fire, with ingredients added as they become available. Yesterday's leftovers become today's base. It's economical, sure, but culinary excitement it is not. Meat? Meat. For most peasants, meat was a rare treat, not a daily expectation. You might have a pig, as we discussed, which would be slaughtered in the autumn. Every single part of that pig would be used, nothing wasted. The meat would be salted, smoked, or made into sausages to preserve it for the lean winter months. You might occasionally have chicken if you kept them, or perhaps an old hen past her laying days. It's a historical fact that hunting in the Lord's forests was strictly forbidden for peasants. Game like deer, boar, or even rabbits were the property of the nobility. Poaching carried severe penalties, from fines to mutilation, like having a hand chopped off, or even death. So that juicy venison steak you might picture on a medieval table, not on yours, unless you're feeling particularly suicidal. You might get lucky and trap a small bird or a squirrel, but it wouldn't be a feast. Fish could be an important source of protein, especially if you live near a river, lake, or the coast. And the church, with its many fast days, days when eating meat was forbidden, which could be up to half the year, certainly encouraged fish consumption. Fresh fish was great if you could get it, but preserving it was key. So, you'd encounter a lot of salted, smoked or dried fish. Cod, herring, which could be incredibly salty and require lengthy soaking before it was even remotely palatable. Think less delicate pan-seared sole and more chewy, intensely flavoured fish jerky. And remember those questionable sanitation standards? Fish from polluted town rivers. Well, you're taking your chances. What about fruits and vegetables? You'd eat what was seasonal and what you could grow in your small garden plot or forage. Apples, pears and berries in the summer and autumn. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were winter staples. Leafy greens were around, but often cooked extensively in the aforementioned pottage, losing much of their texture and some nutrients. Historians still argue whether the average medieval peasant diet provided sufficient vitamins and minerals, with many suspecting widespread deficiencies, particularly of vitamin C, especially in winter and early spring. This could lead to conditions like scurvy, weakening your already stressed body. Dairy products like milk, cheese and butter would be part of your diet if your family was fortunate enough to own a cow or some goats. But milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Cheese, therefore, was a common way to preserve milk's goodness, but it would likely be a hard, strong-flavoured farmhouse cheese, not your creamy brie. Butter was a luxury. And what are you washing all this down with? Water, of course, was essential, but finding clean water could be a challenge. Wells could be contaminated, especially in more populated areas, and rivers often served as open sewers. So the drink of choice for many, even children, was small beer, or weak ale. This was a low-alcohol brew, and the brewing process itself, involving boiling the water, actually made it safer to drink than water from dubious sources. It also provided some extra calories, which you desperately needed. Wine was produced in many parts of Europe, but good wine was generally for the wealthier echelons of society or for export. You might get the dregs, or very rough local stuff. Fruit juices would be seasonal and unpreserved. Let's talk about food safety. There are no sell-by dates, no health inspectors, apart from maybe guild officials checking weights and measures, but not so much the bacteriological content. Food adulteration was a common problem. A quirky and rather unsettling tidbit is the documented practice of some unscrupulous medieval bakers putting things like sand, chalk, or even sawdust into flour to bulk it out and increase their profits. Millers might be accused of taking too much of the grain as their fee. The miller's thumb was said to be golden from ill-gotten gains. Butchers might try to pass off old meat as fresh, or meat from diseased animals. Your senses, smell, sight, and a healthy dose of suspicion were your main defences against food poisoning, which, with no antibiotics or IV drips, could easily be a death sentence. Imagine your daily routine. You wake up, probably eat some stale bread and a bit of leftover pottage from the night before, or maybe just some bread dipped in ale. You work all day. Your midday meal, if you get one, is more bread, perhaps a lump of cheese if you're lucky, or some cold pottage carried to the fields. Then, in the evening, it's back to the simmering pot for another round of pottage, maybe with a bit of bacon rind thrown in for flavour if it's a special occasion. On a feast day, perhaps a religious holiday, there might be more meat, better ale, maybe even a sweet treat like honey cakes. But those days are exceptions, bright spots in a generally monotonous and utilitarian culinary landscape. You're eating to survive, not for pleasure. And the constant threat of hunger, of a failed harvest leading to famine, is a dark cloud that always hovers. It's a world where picky eater isn't a recognised condition, because you eat what you're given, or you go hungry. And a rumbling stomach is a far more common companion than a satisfied sigh after a delicious meal. It makes that slightly overcooked microwave meal you had last night seem like a banquet, doesn't it? You've eaten your meagre, monotonous meal, probably some gritty bread and a bowl of never-ending pottage, and now, perhaps, you need to venture into town. Maybe you're an apprentice running an errand for your master, or a peasant bringing some meagre produce to sell at the market, hoping to earn a few precious pennies. As you approach the town walls, you might feel a flicker of excitement. Towns, after all, are centres of commerce, craft, and a slightly more varied human experience than the rural fields. But that excitement will soon be tempered, if not entirely extinguished, by what you see, and especially by what you smell. Because navigating a medieval town is an exercise in dodging filth and trying not to breathe too deeply. Welcome to the urban cesspool. Forget paved sidewalks, neat boulevards, or organised waste collection. The streets you're walking on are likely narrow, unpaved, and deeply rutted. When it rains, they transform into muddy quagmires, sucking at your worn leather shoes, if you even have them, Many peasants went barefoot or wore simple wooden clogs. When it's dry, they're dusty and uneven. And what's in that mud and dust? Well, let's just say it's a rich organic tapestry. The primary issue is waste disposal, or rather, the almost complete lack thereof. There's no municipal garbage collection, no neatly lined bins awaiting a weekly pickup. People simply threw their household waste out of their windows or doors directly into the street. This would include everything. Food scraps, remember that questionable pottage? Broken pottery, old rags, ashes from the fire, and yes, the contents of chamber pots. That's right. Human and animal excrement are a standard feature of the urban landscape. Some towns had regulations about when you could chuck your sewage into the street, usually at night, after a warning cry of "Gardez-le," from the French "Gare de l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. But compliance was patchy, and even if it was followed, it just meant the muck accumulated under the cover of darkness, waiting to greet you in the morning. So as you trudge through the street, you're navigating a slalom course of refuse heaps, puddles of indeterminate liquid, and the omnipresent animal dung. Pigs, dogs, chickens and horses roamed freely in many towns, adding their own contributions to the general mess. The stench would be overpowering, a complex bouquet of rotting garbage, animal waste, human effluent, and the various smells of industry. The tannery with its decaying hides and pungent chemicals, the dyer's vats, the butcher's shop with its blood and offal. You'd probably develop a permanent nose wrinkle. It's a historical fact that some medieval towns had open channels or gutters running down the centre or sides of the streets, intended to carry away rainwater, and, by extension, some of the filth. However, these were often poorly maintained, frequently clogged, and in dry weather they simply became elongated cesspits, festering in the sun. The houses themselves are built close together, often with upper stories that jetted out over the street below, further narrowing the passage and blocking out sunlight and fresh air. This creates a dark, damp and claustrophobic environment at street level. Down the darkest, narrowest alleyways, the filth might pile up undisturbed for weeks, creating a truly hazardous brew. And where does all this muck eventually go? Some of it might be washed away by heavy rain into the nearest river. Convenient, right? Except that same river is likely the town's primary source of drinking water, water for brewing, and for industries like cloth fulling. So you're essentially drinking your neighbour's toilet, and their neighbours, and the local tannery's runoff. Delicious. This, unsurprisingly, was a major contributor to the spread of diseases like cholera and typhoid. Let's talk about personal hygiene in this environment. Public baths existed in some towns, a legacy from Roman times, but their reputation was often mixed. They could be associated with prostitution and general rowdiness, and by the later Middle Ages many fell out of favour or were closed down, partly due to fears that they contributed to the spread of disease, ironically given the alternative. For most people, a full body wash was an infrequent event. You might wash your hands and face perhaps, but lugging water, heating it, and then finding a private place to bathe in a crowded hovel was a significant undertaking, so people were generally not smelling like a spring meadow. Add that to the ambient stench of the streets, and you have an olfactory experience that modern noses are entirely unprepared for. And what about pests? With all that garbage lying around, medieval towns were a paradise for rats, mice, flies, and fleas. A quirky and rather disgusting tidbit is that rat catchers were a recognised profession, but they could hardly keep up with the sheer volume of rodents. These vermin weren't just an annoyance, they were vectors for disease. The fleas on the rats, as we'll discuss later in more detail, were the primary carriers of the bubonic plague. So, every scurrying shadow in the periphery, every buzzing insect is a potential harbinger of death. You'd probably be constantly itchy, not just from your coarse woolen clothes, but from the liberal sprinkling of fleas and lice that were common companions. Remember that saying, snug as a bug in a rug? They were probably talking about a louse. Now, not every part of every town was an absolute hellscape of filth. Some wealthier districts might have been slightly cleaner, and some towns did make efforts to legislate for street cleaning. For example, by making householders responsible for cleaning the patch in front of their own property. Historians still argue whether the general state of urban sanitation improved or declined over the course of the Middle Ages, with some evidence suggesting early efforts at civic hygiene were later overwhelmed by population growth and changing attitudes. But even the best case scenario would be considered deeply unsanitary by today's standards. Marketplaces, while vibrant with activity, were also hotspots for accumulated refuse from unsold goods, animal droppings, and the general detritus of commerce. Imagine the scene. Butchers slaughtering animals right there in the market square, the blood and guts draining into the already filthy street, flies buzzing enthusiastically. You try to buy a piece of cheese while holding your breath and trying not to step in something unidentifiable. It's a far cry from your sterile, air-conditioned supermarket experience. So as you hurry through the town on your errand, you're not just trying to avoid being pickpocketed, a common urban hazard. You're actively trying to avoid direct contact with a street surface that is, frankly, a biological weapon. You might hold a scented handkerchief to your nose if you're wealthy enough, or just try to breathe shallowly. You see people emptying slop buckets from upper windows. You hear the squeal of pigs rooting through a garbage pile, and you feel a constant sense of unease about what you might be treading in, or what diseases you might be breathing in. The glamour of the bustling medieval city quickly fades when you realise it's bustling with bacteria and reeking of decay. You'd probably long for the relatively cleaner, though still hardly pristine air of your rural hovel, and if you accidentally slip and fall, well, let's just hope you have a strong stomach and access to a very, very large bucket of, hopefully clean, water. Just try not to think about what that water might have been used for earlier. Alright, so you've braved the treacherous, reeking streets of a medieval town, trying your best not to become intimately acquainted with their unsanitary offerings. But inevitably, living in such conditions, or even just passing through them, exposes you to a whole host of ailments. Or perhaps it's not the town's fault. Maybe you've developed a raging fever back in your smoky village hut, or a nasty infection from a minor cut you got while scything hay. Sooner or later you're going to get sick, and when you do, you're going to seek out medical help. Prepare for an experience that often offers more agonizing pain, bizarre treatments, and terrifying uncertainty than actual relief. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where first do no harm sometimes felt more like an optional guideline. Your first port of call might not be a physician in the modern sense. University-trained physicians were relatively rare and expensive, mostly serving the wealthy in larger towns or noble courts. For most ordinary folk, healthcare was a patchwork of local healers. This could be a village-wise woman or cunning man who possessed a deep knowledge of herbal remedies passed down through generations. Some of these herbal treatments might actually have been effective. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, and was used for pain and fever. It's a historical fact that many effective botanical remedies known to medieval healers formed the basis for later pharmaceutical discoveries. So, you might get lucky and receive something genuinely helpful for your aches and pains. However, this folk medicine was also deeply intertwined with superstition, charms, and magical incantations. So, alongside your herbal poultice, you might be instructed to recite a specific prayer backwards, wear an amulet made of questionable materials, a dried toad perhaps, or drink water that a saint's relic had been dipped in. The line between medicine, magic, and religion was very blurry indeed. If your ailment is more serious, or if the local healer is stumped, you might seek out a barber surgeon. Yes, you read that right. Barbers in medieval times didn't just cut hair and shave beards, they were also the go-to practitioners for a range of hands-on medical procedures. This included bloodletting, a hugely popular treatment for almost everything. Lancing boils, setting broken bones, pulling teeth, more on that horror show later, and even performing minor surgeries like amputations or cataract couching. Their training was usually through apprenticeship, not formal university education, and their understanding of anatomy and infection was, shall we say, limited. Imagine the guy who just gave you a slightly lopsided haircut now approaching you with a saw and a determined look. Comforting, isn't it? Let's talk about the dominant medical theory of the time, humouralism. This ancient Greek idea, championed by Galen, proposed that the body contained 4 essential fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was achieved when these humours were in perfect balance. Illness, therefore, was caused by an imbalance. Too much of one, not enough of another. The physician's job was to identify the imbalance and restore equilibrium. How? Primarily through evacuative therapies. This meant getting the excess humour out of your body. Bloodletting was the star of this show. Feeling feverish? You've got too much hot, moist blood. Let's bleed you. Feeling melancholic? That's an excess of cold, dry, black bile. Bleeding might help that too, somehow. The physician or barber surgeon would open a vein with a lancet or apply leeches and drain a prescribed amount of blood. A quirky and rather alarming tidbit is the existence of detailed charts showing which veins to bleed for specific ailments affecting different parts of the body. They even considered astrological signs to determine the most auspicious time for letting blood. The amount of blood taken could be substantial, sometimes leading to fainting or even death from exsanguination, especially if the patient was already weakened. Instead of curing you, it could very well kill you faster. Ah, he's looking a bit pale after we took a pint. Perhaps another half pint will perk him right up. Famous last words, probably. Other methods of rebalancing humours included inducing vomiting with emetics, like wine laced with hellebore, a rather toxic plant, purging the bowels with strong laxatives, senna, rhubarb, or even more aggressive concoctions, or making you sweat profusely. The idea was that if you felt absolutely wretched during the treatment, it must be working. Hygiene during these procedures? Largely an afterthought. The same unwashed lancet might be used on multiple patients. Surgical instruments, if used, were not sterilised. The concept of germs causing infection was centuries away. So, even if the procedure itself didn't kill you, the subsequent infection very well might. Diagnosis was also an interesting affair. Physicians relied heavily on observing the patient's pulse, urine, and sometimes even feces. Historians still argue whether the detailed uroscopy charts, which link the colour, sediment, and even smell and taste of urine to specific diseases, had any genuine diagnostic value or were largely theatrical. Physicians would hold up a flask of urine to the light, swirl it around, sniff it, and pronounce a diagnosis with great authority. Sometimes they even tasted it. Imagine your doctor today asking for a urine sample and then taking a little sip. You'd be looking for the exit, and rightly so. If you needed surgery, say for a bladder stone, agonisingly common due to diet, or an amputation after a battlefield wound or severe infection, it was a terrifying prospect. Anesthesia as we know it didn't exist. You might be given alcohol, opium or mandrake root to dull the pain, but you'd be very much awake and aware. Patients were physically restrained, and the surgeon worked as quickly as possible, which wasn't always conducive to precision. Cauterization, searing the wound with a red-hot iron to stop bleeding, was a common and excruciatingly painful technique. Survival rates for major surgeries were, unsurprisingly, very low. The pain alone could send a patient into shock. What if you had a mental illness? These were often attributed to demonic possession, witchcraft, or a severe humoral imbalance, like too much black bile leading to melancholy. Treatments could range from prayers and exorcisms to confinement in often brutal conditions, or more physical treatments like trepanning, drilling a hole in the skull to release evil spirits or built-up pressure. Yes, they literally drilled holes in people's heads, sometimes with surprisingly good survival rates, though what good meant in that context is debatable. So, when you fall ill in the Middle Ages, you're faced with a grim set of choices. Do you trust the local wise woman with her herbs and charms? Do you submit to the barber surgeon's enthusiastic bloodletting? Or do you hope to afford a learned physician who will gravely inspect your pee and prescribe a diet of more pottage, probably, but with specific herbs? The placebo effect must have been working overtime, because genuine cures for serious internal ailments were few and far between. More often than not, treatment was an ordeal to be endured, and recovery, if it came, was often in spite of, rather than because of, the medical intervention. You'd probably think twice before complaining about a headache, lest someone suggest a good bleeding or, heaven forbid, a prophylactic trepanning to let the bad humours out. You've managed to avoid the town cesspools for a while, and perhaps you've even sidestepped the enthusiastic bloodletting of the local barber surgeon after a bout of generic medieval malaise. But there's one insidious, throbbing agony that almost everyone, rich or poor, would experience with a cold dread: toothache. In an era utterly devoid of modern dentistry, a simple cavity, a cracked tooth, or an abscess wasn't just a nuisance to be fixed with a quick filling or a root canal. It was a potential gateway to excruciating pain, debilitating infection, and in some cases, a slow, miserable death. Your medieval dentist appointment is not going to involve a comfy reclining chair or a friendly hygienist offering you a choice of bibs. Oral hygiene, as you might guess from the general lack of sanitation we've already discussed, was rudimentary at best. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist. People might rub their teeth with a rough linen cloth, perhaps with some salt or powdered sage as a mild abrasive. Twigs from certain trees like hazel or miswak, which actually has some antimicrobial properties, might be chewed to help clean the teeth. It's a historical fact that some medieval recipes for tooth powders included ingredients like powdered bone, crushed eggshells, or even more bizarre substances like burnt mouse heads or rabbit brains. The goal was to whiten teeth and freshen breath, but the effectiveness against decay was minimal, and some of these concoctions could be highly abrasive, damaging the enamel. Your diet, while not high in refined sugars like today, still posed risks. The coarse, gritty bread we talked about could wear down enamel over time. Honey was the main sweetener, and while natural, it's still sugar that bacteria can feast on. Fruit, while healthy, also contains sugars and acids, and with infrequent or ineffective cleaning, plaque would build up, leading to cavities and gum disease. So you start to feel that familiar dull throb in your jaw. At first you ignore it. You have work to do after all. But the pain intensifies, becoming a sharp, stabbing agony that makes it hard to eat, sleep, or think. Home remedies would be the first line of defence. Poultices of herbs like clove, which does have analgesic properties, or henbane, a rather dangerous narcotic, might be applied to the cheek. You might be advised to rinse your mouth with wine or vinegar. Some remedies involved holding a hot stone against the face, or fumigating the mouth with the smoke of burning seeds, in the belief that the pain was caused by tiny toothworms that needed to be smoked out. A quirky and frankly terrifying tidbit is that some practitioners claim to be able to extract these imaginary toothworms, sometimes performing a sleight of hand trick to produce a maggot or small worm as proof of their success. You'd pay for this service, of course, and probably still have the toothache. When the pain becomes unbearable and your face starts to swell from an abscess, you have little choice but to seek out someone to pull the offending tooth. This task usually fell to the aforementioned barber surgeons, or sometimes to itinerant tooth pullers who would set up shop at markets and fairs. These individuals were not trained dentists in any modern sense. Their primary qualification was often brute strength, and a collection of fearsome-looking iron tools, pelicans, forceps and elevators, designed to grip, loosen and yank. There's no anaesthetic. Let that sink in. No Novocaine, no nitrous oxide. You might be given a stiff drink of alcohol, or perhaps some opium if you're very lucky and can afford it. But you will be acutely aware of every moment of the procedure. You'd be seated on a low stool, or sometimes even on the floor, your head held firmly by an assistant or pinned against a wall. The tooth puller would inspect your mouth, probably with unwashed hands, prod around with a metal instrument to identify the culprit, and then get to work. The process was brutal. The instruments were crude. The goal was to extract the tooth as quickly as possible, but this often meant breaking the tooth, leaving roots behind, or damaging adjacent teeth and the jawbone. The sound of creaking, cracking, and the tearing of ligaments, accompanied by your own, understandably loud screams, would be the soundtrack to this ordeal. Bleeding would be profuse, and infection was an enormous risk. The tooth puller might stuff the socket with lint or a piece of cloth, perhaps dipped in some styptic, blood-stopping herb, but the chances of bacteria getting into that open wound were incredibly high. Historians still argue whether the risk of death from a post-extraction infection outweighed the misery of a chronic tooth abscess, but for many, the immediate relief from agonizing pain made the gamble seem worthwhile. If the infection from an abscessed tooth was left untreated, or if an extraction went badly, the consequences could be dire. The infection could spread into the jawbone, osteomyelitis, into the sinuses, or even into the bloodstream, leading to sepsis. A large facial swelling could obstruct breathing. Ludwig's angina, a severe infection of the floor of the mouth, could be fatal. You could literally die from a toothache. Imagine that constant throbbing pain, the fever, the swelling that distorts your face, knowing that the available cures are almost as frightening as the disease itself. It certainly puts that twinge you feel when eating ice cream into perspective. Even if you were lucky enough to avoid major complications, losing teeth was a common part of aging. By middle age, many people would have lost a significant number of teeth, affecting their ability to eat, their speech, and their appearance. Dentures existed, but they were crude, expensive, and often uncomfortable, made from animal bone, ivory, or even human teeth, sometimes scavenged from battlefields or robbed from graves. Charming. For most, toothlessness was just another indignity of growing older in this period. So, as you sit there, cradling your swollen jaw, the medieval world suddenly feels a lot less romantic. The valiant knights, the soaring cathedrals, the mystical forests, none of it seems quite so appealing when you're facing the prospect of a blacksmith-sized man with a rusty pair of pliers coming at your mouth with the sole intention of ripping a piece of your skull out. You'd probably give anything for a tube of Oragel and a soft bristled toothbrush, and you'd certainly never ever complain about going to the dentist again. That gentle whir of the drill, music to your ears compared to the medieval alternative, open wide, would have been the two most terrifying words in the English language. You've somehow managed to survive the perils of birth, the back-breaking labour of childhood, the monotonous and often questionable diet, the filth-ridden streets of the towns, and perhaps even a harrowing encounter with a medieval tooth-puller. You might think you've earned a bit of peace and quiet. Unfortunately, peace in medieval Europe was often a fleeting dream, a temporary lull between periods of violence. Your life is lived under the constant shadow of warfare, and it doesn't matter if you're a peasant, a merchant, or a noble. When war comes, everyone suffers. Forget a quiet life tilling your field or crafting your wares. You're far more likely to face raids, sieges, and the ever-present threat of conscription. Warfare was endemic in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just large-scale conflicts between kingdoms, like the 100 Years' War between England and France, which dragged on for, well, over 100 years. It's a historical fact that feudal society itself was structured around a military class, the knights and nobility, whose primary function was to wage war. Their lands and titles were often granted in exchange for military service to a higher lord or king. This created a system where armed conflict was a common tool for resolving disputes, acquiring territory, or simply demonstrating power. Small-scale private wars between local lords were frequent, meaning that even if your kingdom wasn't officially at war, your particular region might be. For you, the ordinary peasant, this means your village, your fields, your very livelihood are on the front line. Armies on the march, whether supposedly friendly or overtly hostile, needed to be. Fed, they would routinely live off the land, which is a polite way of saying they would confiscate your grain, your livestock, and anything else of value. Resistance was met with violence. Your carefully tended crops could be trampled or burned, your animals driven off, your meagre savings stolen, and that's if you're lucky. Raiding parties, especially in border regions or during periods of intense conflict, wouldn't just take your stuff. They might burn your village to the ground, slaughter those who resisted, and carry off others as captives or slaves. Imagine huddling in terror with your family, listening to the sounds of approaching hoofbeats and shouting, knowing that your world could be utterly destroyed in a matter of hours. If your village or town happened to be strategically important, or if it incurred the wrath of a powerful lord, you might find yourself enduring a siege. This was a particularly grim experience. The attacking army would surround the town walls, cutting off all supplies of food and water. Starvation and disease would quickly set in within the besieged settlement. A quirky and rather grim tidbit from siege warfare is the practice of catapulting diseased animal carcasses, or even human bodies, over the walls to spread sickness and demoralize the defenders. Sort of an early and very unpleasant form of biological warfare. If the siege was successful and the town fell, the aftermath was often brutal. Widespread looting, massacre of the defenders, and often civilians, and enslavement. Even if your side won by holding out, the cost in lives and resources would be devastating. You might survive the siege only to face famine and rampant disease in its aftermath. And what if you're a young, able-bodied man? Well, congratulations, you're prime material for conscription. While the core of medieval armies was often made up of professional men-at-arms and knights, larger campaigns required swelling the ranks with levies of infantry, often drawn from the peasantry. Your lord could call upon you to fulfill your feudal obligation of military service. This wasn't a career choice, it was a duty, and refusal could have severe consequences. So, you might be plucked from your fields, handed a rudimentary weapon like a spear or a billhook. If you were lucky, you might get a helmet and some padded armour, but don't count on it. Given minimal training, and marched off to fight in a battle you barely understand for a cause that means little to your daily survival. The experience of battle for such an infantryman was terrifying. You're facing heavily armoured knights on horseback, volleys of arrows from longbows or crossbows that could pierce through basic armour, and the sheer bloody chaos of close quarters combat. Historians still argue about the exact casualty rates in medieval battles, but for the poorly equipped infantry, they were often catastrophically high. If you were wounded, medical care on the battlefield was virtually non-existent. A serious injury likely meant a slow, agonising death. Or if you were captured by the enemy, you might be killed or held for a meagre ransom your family could never afford. Even if you survived the battle unscathed, the campaign itself was fraught with peril. Disease spread like wildfire through army camps due to poor sanitation and close quarters. Remember those street cesspools? Now imagine thousands of men living like that in one place. Starvation was also a constant threat if supply lines broke down. You might win the battle but die of dysentery a week later. It's a bit like winning the lottery and then immediately getting hit by a bus driven by a particularly aggressive strain of bacteria. Even if you weren't directly involved in fighting, the economic consequences of war were severe. Kings and lords needed money to fund their campaigns, to pay mercenaries, buy equipment, and build fortifications. This meant higher taxes for everyone. Peasants might have to give up a larger share of their already meagre harvest. Merchants might face new tolls and levies. The disruption to trade routes could ruin businesses and lead to shortages of essential goods. War was an economic black hole, sucking resources out of the productive economy and into destruction. The psychological toll of living in such a violent and unpredictable world must have been immense. The constant fear of raids, the trauma of witnessing or experiencing violence, the loss of loved ones. These would have been common experiences. There was no therapy, no PTSD support groups. You just had to endure it, finding solace perhaps in your faith or your community, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. The good old days were often anything but. They were days of clashing steel, burning homes, and the ever-present spectre of sudden, violent death. You might long for the simple boredom of weeding the fields, if only the local baron wasn't feuding with the baron from the next valley over your particular patch of cabbages. So you're living in this world of constant toil, questionable food, rampant disease, and the ever-present threat of war. Now let's imagine you find yourself on the wrong side of the law, or even just on the wrong side of someone more powerful than you. What happens then? Forget innocent until proven guilty, Miranda writes, or a comfortable prison cell with 3 square meals and cable TV. Justice in medieval times was often swift, frequently brutal, and almost always a public spectacle designed to entertain as much as to punish. If you're accused of a crime, you're about to enter a system where your chances of a fair trial are slim, and the punishments are something out of a horror film. The very concept of law was a complex patchwork. There was canon law, church law, feudal law governing relationships between lords and vassals, manorial law, specific to the estate you lived on, administered by the lord of the manor, and emergent royal law. Which court you ended up in depended on your social status and the nature of your alleged offence. For a peasant, many minor disputes and offences would be handled in the manorial court. The lord or his steward would preside, and judgments were often based on local custom. It's a historical fact that these manorial courts dealt with a vast range of everyday issues, from disputes over land boundaries and unpaid debts to accusations of petty theft or assault. Fines were a common punishment, often paid in goods or labour if you lacked coin. But what if the accusation is more serious, say, murder, treason, robbery, or even something like persistent poaching? Remember, don't touch the Lord's deer. Then you might find yourself in a royal court or a higher feudal court. Here, the procedures could be even more bewildering and stacked against you. Legal representation as we know it was rare for commoners. You'd largely be on your own, trying to navigate a system you didn't understand, facing accusers who might have more influence or resources. One of the most striking features of medieval justice, particularly in the earlier part of the period, was the use of trial by ordeal. This was a method of appealing to God to determine guilt or innocence when evidence was lacking or inconclusive. There were several charming varieties. Trial by hot iron involved carrying a red-hot piece of iron for a set distance, or picking up a stone from the bottom of a cauldron of boiling water. Your hand would then be bandaged and inspected after 3 days. If it was healing cleanly, God had declared you innocent. If it was festering, which given the lack of hygiene was highly likely, you were guilty. Trial by cold water was another favourite. You'd be bound and thrown into a river or pond that had been blessed. If you sank, you were considered innocent, though you might drown in the process of proving it, which was a bit of a design flaw. If you floated, the holy water was deemed to be rejecting you, so you were guilty. Historians still argue about the extent to which these ordeals were manipulated by those administering them, and whether the clergy truly believed in their divine efficacy, or saw them more as a psychological tool to extract confessions. Thankfully, the Church began to officially discourage trial by ordeal by the early 13th century, leading to the wider adoption of trial by jury, but it was a slow transition. Trial by combat was another option, particularly for the nobility. Accuser and accused, or their chosen champions, would fight it out with the winner supposedly being vindicated by God. This sounds dramatic, and it was, but it hardly seems like a reliable way to determine factual guilt. It was more about might making right, with a divine rubber stamp. For commoners, if juries became more common, they weren't juries of your peers in the modern sense. They were often men of local standing who might already have opinions about you or be influenced by the local lord. And the punishments? Oh, the punishments. They were designed to be a deterrent, and that meant making them as gruesome and public as possible. Fines were common for lesser offences, but for more serious crimes things got nasty. The stocks and pillory were popular for public humiliation. You'd be locked in, exposed to the jeers and missiles, rotten fruit, animal dung, stones, of the crowd for hours or even days. Whipping was another common corporal punishment, administered publicly with a lash or birch rods, leaving you bloody and shamed. For crimes deemed capital offences, murder, treason, heresy, sometimes even grand larceny or repeated poaching, the death penalty was widely used, and they got creative with it. Hanging was standard, often carried out at prominent crossroads or on a hill overlooking the town, the bodies sometimes left to rot as a grim warning. A quirky and deeply unpleasant tidbit is the punishment of being hanged, drawn and quartered, reserved primarily for traitors in England. This involved being hanged until almost dead, then disemboweled while still alive, your entrails burned before your eyes, and finally your body beheaded and cut into 4 pieces, which would be displayed in different parts of the kingdom. It's hard to imagine a more horrific end. Burning at the stake was the preferred method for heresy, and sometimes for witchcraft or coining, counterfeiting money. Beheading was generally considered a more honourable death, often reserved for the nobility. Drowning was used for some crimes, particularly for women in some regions. Prisons as places of long-term incarceration for punishment were not as common as they are today. Jails existed, but they were often just holding places before trial or execution, or for debtors. Conditions in these medieval jails were appalling. Dark, damp, overcrowded, unhygienic, and often run by corrupt jailers who would extort money from prisoners for food or basic comforts. You could easily die of disease in jail before you even got to your probably unfair trial. It makes Alcatraz look like a spa retreat. The spectacle of punishment was key. Executions were public holidays, drawing large crowds. People would bring their children. It was entertainment, a moral lesson, and a powerful display of authority all rolled into one. Imagine packing a picnic to go watch a man be disemboweled. It speaks to a very different sensibility, a desensitization to violence and suffering that was perhaps necessary for survival in such a harsh world. So, if you're accused of stealing a loaf of bread because your family is starving, you might face a fine you can't pay, a public flogging, or even branding with a hot iron so everyone knows you're a thief. If you're outspoken against the local priest or lord, you might find yourself accused of heresy or treason, facing torture to extract a confession, and then a fiery or grisly death. The concept of cruel and unusual punishment hadn't been invented yet. In fact, cruel and unusual was pretty much the standard operating procedure. You'd learn very quickly to keep your head down, your opinions to yourself, and your hands off the Lord's rabbits. And if you saw the executioner setting up his block in the town square, you'd probably say a quick prayer that he wasn't there for you. You've navigated the perilous legal system, perhaps by sheer luck or by keeping an extremely low profile, and you're still breathing. But even if you manage to avoid accusations of crime and the subsequent brutal punishments, there's a fundamental aspect of medieval life that dictates almost every facet of your existence, from where you live and what you eat to who you marry and what work you do. It's the rigid, unyielding social hierarchy. Forget about climbing the ladder of success through hard work and talent. In the Middle Ages, your birth is your destiny, and for most people, that destiny is to remain firmly planted on the bottom rungs of a very tall, very steep, and very unshakable ladder. Medieval society was broadly structured around a system often simplified as those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. At the very top you have the king, divinely ordained, or so he'd have you believe, and holding ultimate authority, at least in theory. Below him are the high nobility, dukes, earls, barons, who hold large swathes of land, fiefs, from the king in exchange for military support and loyalty. These are those who fight, the warrior aristocracy. They live in castles, enjoy wealth and privilege, and their main occupations are warfare, politics, and managing their vast estates. If you're born into this class, life can be pretty good, filled with hunting, feasting, tournaments, and a certain degree of power, though it also comes with its own dangers and obligations, as we've seen with constant warfare. Then you have those who pray, the clergy. The church was an immensely powerful institution, a parallel hierarchy with its own laws, lands, and vast wealth. From the Pope and cardinals down to archbishops, bishops, abbots, and then the local priests and monks, the clergy held enormous spiritual and often temporal power. A career in the church was one of the very few avenues for social advancement for someone not born into nobility, particularly if you were intelligent and educated, literacy being a key skill largely confined to the clergy for much of the period. However, even within the church, higher positions were often dominated by men from noble families. And then there's everyone else, those who work. This is by far the largest group, encompassing well over 90% of the population. This is almost certainly where you find yourself. Within this massive category, there are further gradations. In the countryside, the majority are peasants. Some peasants were free, meaning they rented their land and had some autonomy, but many, especially in the earlier medieval period, were serfs. It's a historical fact that serfdom bound peasants to the land. They were not slaves in the sense of being owned outright as property, but they were not free to leave the manor without the lord's permission. They owed labour services to their lord, working his fields, called the domain, for a set number of days per week, as well as various dues and taxes often paid in produce. Your life as a serf is one of unrelenting toil, with little personal freedom and almost no chance of changing your circumstances. You're born on your lord's land, you work his land, and you will die on his land. In the growing towns and cities, you find a different kind of worker: artisans, craftsmen, merchants, and labourers. Here, there was a bit more dynamism and potential for social mobility, but it was still highly structured. Guilds controlled various trades: weavers, bakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, etc. These organisations set standards for quality, regulated prices, and controlled who could practice trade. You'd start as an apprentice, remember that childhood experience, hopefully become a journeyman, a qualified worker paid a wage, and if you were skilled, saved enough money, and perhaps married the master's daughter, you might eventually become a master craftsman yourself, owning your own workshop. This was a form of upward mobility, but it was a slow climb, and guilds could be very restrictive. Merchants, especially those involved in long-distance trade, could accumulate significant wealth and influence, sometimes rivaling that of the lesser nobility. However, even a wealthy merchant was generally considered socially inferior to a landowning noble, no matter how impoverished that noble might be. Historians still argue about the precise degree of social mobility possible in the Middle Ages, with some emphasising the rigidity of the system, while others point to exceptions and gradual shifts, especially in urban centres. What this rigid social structure means for you is that your opportunities are severely limited by the circumstances of your birth. If you're born a peasant, you will be a peasant. Your children will be peasants. The idea of making something of yourself in a way that dramatically changes. Your social standing is almost unheard of. Your clothing, your diet, the very way you speak will mark you as belonging to a particular class. A quirky, though illustrative tidbit is the existence of sumptuary laws in some places and times. These were regulations that dictated what kinds of clothing, fabrics, colours, and even foods were permissible for different social classes. A peasant wearing silk or purple. Unthinkable, and possibly illegal. It was all about maintaining visible distinctions between the orders of society. This hierarchy was reinforced by religious doctrine. The idea of the great chain of being positioned every created thing in a divinely ordained order, from God at the top, down through angels, humans, with kings above nobles, nobles above commoners, animals, plants, and minerals. To challenge your place in this order was to challenge God's will. This ideology helped to keep people, especially those at the bottom, in their place, accepting their lot as divinely sanctioned. So, you live your life knowing your boundaries. You defer to your social superiors, the local priest, the lord of the manor, any passing knight. You speak when spoken to. You understand the unwritten, and sometimes very explicitly written, rules of deference and obligation. Trying to rise above your station could be met with suspicion, resentment, or even punishment. It's a world that values stability and order, even if that order means a life of hardship and limited horizons for the vast majority. Imagine the frustration of being intelligent and ambitious, but knowing that because your father was a Duncarter, you too are destined to be a Duncarter, regardless of your potential. There's no medieval dream of going from rags to riches through sheer grit. It's more like rags to slightly less tattered rags if you're incredibly lucky and don't annoy anyone important. This lack of agency, this predetermined path, would be a profoundly disempowering aspect of medieval life for anyone with a spark of ambition or a desire for self-determination. We've talked about the rigid social ranks that define your life, but within every one of those ranks, from the highest noble household to the humblest peasant hut, there's another layer of hierarchy and hardship that we need to explore, specifically if you happen to be born female. For women in the Middle Ages, life came with a unique set of burdens, limited rights, and ever-present dangers. Regardless of your social standing, your gender would profoundly shape your experiences, often in ways that were restrictive, demanding, and perilous. From arranged marriages to the life-threatening ordeal of childbirth, role as a wife and mother, or perhaps, for some, a nun. Noble women might learn to read, often religious texts or romances, manage a household, do fine needlework and perhaps some music. Peasant girls learned the practical skills of running a home, farming, spinning, and childcare from their mothers. Formal scholarly education, like that available in universities, was almost exclusively for men. There were, of course, exceptionally learned women, abbesses who ran large monastic communities, queens who wielded considerable influence, writers like Christine de Pizan who challenged misogynistic views, but they were outliers, not the norm. Marriage was not typically a matter of romantic love, especially for the nobility and wealthier classes. It was an economic and social arrangement, a strategic alliance between families. Historians still argue about the average age of marriage for peasant women, but for noble women, betrothals could occur in childhood, and marriages often took place in their early to mid-teens. Your future husband would be chosen by your parents, with an eye towards dowries, land and connections. Your own preference in the matter was rarely a primary consideration. You were an asset, a means to forge alliances or consolidate family wealth. Refusal was often not an option, or came with severe social and familial consequences. Once married, your primary duty was to produce heirs, preferably male, to continue your husband's lineage. And this brings us to the most dangerous undertaking for a medieval woman, childbirth. We touched on the perils of birth in section 1, but it bears repeating from the mother's perspective. With no understanding of germ theory, rudimentary medical assistance, and high rates of maternal mortality, every pregnancy was a gamble with death. Complications like breech birth, postpartum hemorrhage, or puerperal fever, childbed fever, and infection after childbirth were often fatal. A quirky though tragic indication of this danger is the common practice of women making their wills when they knew they were pregnant. It was a tacit acknowledgement of the very real possibility that they might not survive. If your husband died, you might find yourself a young widow, perhaps with young children to care for, your future uncertain and often dependent on the goodwill of your late husband's family or your own male relatives. Remarriage was common, sometimes arranged quickly to ensure the continued management of property or the care of children. Daily life for most women was one of relentless work. Peasant women toiled in the fields alongside men, especially during planting and harvest, in addition to all their household responsibilities. Cooking, over an open fire, a smoky and laborious task. Cleaning, a constant battle in a medieval hovel. Fetching water, making and mending clothes, spinning and weaving were near constant activities. Tending the kitchen garden and poultry, and of course, childcare. In towns, women worked in family businesses as shopkeepers, brewers, bakers, and in various crafts, though guild membership was often restricted for them. They were vital to the economy, but their labour was often undervalued or considered secondary to men's. Even within the church, which offered an alternative to marriage for some women, life as a nun, while providing opportunities for education and spiritual devotion, was still within a hierarchical structure largely controlled by men. Abbesses could be powerful figures, but the overall institution was patriarchal. And then there's the pervasive cultural misogyny. Women were often depicted in religious and secular literature as morally weaker, more susceptible to temptation, thanks Eve, and inherently deceitful. This wasn't a universal view, and there were counter-narratives celebrating female virtue and strength, but negative stereotypes were common and influential. This could make women vulnerable to accusations, for instance, of witchcraft, which became a more significant and terrifying threat in the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period. An old woman living alone, perhaps with knowledge of herbs, could easily become a target of suspicion in times of misfortune. Domestic abuse, while difficult to quantify historically, was undoubtedly a reality. With limited legal recourse and societal structures that reinforced male authority within the household, a woman facing a violent husband had few places to turn. The church condemned abuse, but the threshold for intervention was high, and the emphasis was often on a wife's duty to be obedient. So, as a woman in medieval times, your life is circumscribed by your gender from birth. Your education is limited, your choices in marriage are few, your primary role is defined by childbearing and domesticity, and your work is unceasing. You face the profound dangers of childbirth with little effective medical support. You navigate a world where your legal and social standing is secondary to men, and where cultural attitudes can be deeply demeaning. It's a life that demands immense resilience, strength, and fortitude. While there were undoubtedly moments of joy, love, and community, the overarching framework was one of significant constraint and considerable risk. You might look at the knight in shining armour, not with romantic longing, but with a weary sigh, knowing that his heroic adventures are built upon a social structure that often keeps you tethered and toiling, and you'd probably pray fervently for healthy children and a kind husband, because those were among the best things you could hope for in a world that offered you few other paths. You're toiling away in your prescribed social role, whether as a peasant, an artisan, or even a somewhat constrained noblewoman, and all around you, shaping every aspect of your life, is an institution of immense power and pervasive influence, the Church. In medieval Europe, Christianity wasn't just a religion. It was the very bedrock of society, the lens through which the world was understood, and a constant presence from birth to death. Your life is lived under the shadow of the cathedral spire. Your calendar is marked by religious feasts and fasts, and your deepest fears and hopes are often framed in terms of salvation and damnation. The Church rules all aspects of life, and the fear of heresy, of straying from its doctrines, means the threat of certain doom, both in this life and the next. From the moment you're born, the Church is there. As we discussed, you'd be baptized within days, if not hours, of your birth, a crucial sacrament to wash away original sin and ensure your soul's entry into heaven. If you died unbaptized, your fate was limbo, a concept that caused great anxiety for parents. Throughout your childhood, you'd receive religious instruction, learning the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and stories from the Bible, often through sermons, stained glass windows, the Bible of the Poor for the illiterate majority, and religious plays. The local parish church was the centre of your community, not just for worship but for social gatherings, announcements, and even sometimes for markets or local courts held in the churchyard. It's a historical fact that the church bells dictated the rhythm of the day, calling people to prayer and marking the hours for work and rest. Sunday Mass was an obligation, a time to gather, hear the Latin liturgy. which you likely wouldn't understand, but the ritual and symbolism were powerful, and perhaps a sermon in the vernacular. Confession to a priest at least once a year, usually before Easter, was required, followed by penance to absolve your sins. Communion, receiving the Eucharist, was the spiritual highlight. The church calendar governed the year. Major feasts like Christmas, Easter and Pentecost, along with numerous saints' days, punctuated the agricultural cycle, providing days of rest, in theory, though often still filled with obligatory church services, and celebration. There were also fast days, particularly during Lent, the 40 days before Easter, and on Fridays, when abstaining from meat was required. This religious rhythm was deeply embedded in the fabric of daily existence. Remember that fishy diet we talked about? Thank the Church's fasting rules. Beyond spiritual guidance, the Church performed many functions we now associate with the state or secular organisations. It was a major landowner, often one of the wealthiest entities in any region. Monasteries, in particular, were centres of learning, agriculture, and charity. Monks and nuns would care for the sick, in rudimentary hospitals or infirmaries, provide alms for the poor, and offer hospitality to travellers. For a long time, they were also the primary keepers and copiers of ancient texts, preserving knowledge through the so-called Dark Ages. Though let's be honest, if you're trying to get advanced medical care, a monastery infirmary is probably still going to involve a lot of prayer and not a lot of penicillin. But this pervasive influence also came with a darker side, the fear of God's wrath and the Church's power to enforce conformity. Divine displeasure was seen as the cause of misfortune, famine, plague, war. These weren't just random events, they were often interpreted as punishment for sin, either individual or collective. This bred a climate of fear and a constant need for propitiation through prayer, penance, and adherence to church teachings. And then there was heresy. To question the doctrines of the Church, to interpret Scripture in a way not sanctioned by the ecclesiastical authorities, or to engage in practices deemed unchristian, was an incredibly dangerous act. Historians still argue about the motivations and extent of popular support for various medieval heretical movements, such as the Cathars in southern France or the Lollards in England, but the Church's response was often swift and brutal. Accusations of heresy could arise from genuine theological disagreement, but also from personal vendettas or political motivations. If you were accused of heresy, you'd face an inquisitorial process. The Inquisition, a special ecclesiastical court established to combat heresy, had wide-ranging powers. You could be interrogated, often without knowing who your accusers were. Torture was sometimes used to extract confessions, based on the charming logic that physical pain could help purify the soul and lead the heretic back to the true faith, or more pragmatically, get them to say whatever the inquisitors wanted to hear. A quirky and rather chilling tidbit is the detail with which inquisitors' manuals laid out procedures for interrogation and the application of torture, aiming for a kind of legalistic precision in these brutal proceedings. It wasn't just random violence, it was organised violence. If you were found guilty of heresy and refused to recant, or if you relapsed after recanting, the Church would relax you to the secular authorities, a euphemism for handing you over to be executed, usually by burning at the stake. This public execution was meant to be a terrifying spectacle, a warning to others, and a symbolic purification of the community from the taint of heresy. Even if you confessed and recanted, punishments could still be severe. Imprisonment, confiscation of property, being forced to wear symbols of your shame, like yellow crosses sewn onto your clothes, or undertaking long and arduous pilgrimages. This fear of heresy, combined with the Church's immense authority, created a powerful pressure to conform. Thinking outside the accepted religious box was not just discouraged, it was life-threatening. Superstition also played a role, often blending with folk beliefs and official religious doctrine in complex ways. The line between devout prayer to a saint for intervention and a magical incantation to ward off evil could be thin, and the Church itself sometimes struggled to define and control popular religious practices. So, while the Church provided solace, community, a moral framework and even some social services, its power was absolute, and its enforcement mechanisms formidable. Your personal beliefs were not entirely your own. They had to align with the official dogma. Expressing doubt or unconventional ideas, even in private, could be incredibly risky if overheard by the wrong person. It's a world where faith is not just a personal journey, but a public obligation, and where the price for stepping out of line is unimaginably high. You'd probably attend church very regularly, nod enthusiastically at the priest's sermon, even if you didn't understand half of it, and keep any unorthodox thoughts very, very deeply to yourself. And you definitely think twice before suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the Earth goes around the sun. That kind of talk could get you a front row seat at a bonfire you really didn't want to attend. Let's say you have a compelling reason to leave your familiar village or town. Perhaps you're a merchant seeking new markets, a pilgrim on a sacred journey to a distant shrine like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela, a messenger carrying vital news, or maybe you're just trying to escape a local feud or a failed harvest. Whatever your motivation, embarking on a journey in medieval times is not a matter of booking a cheap flight online or hopping on a high-speed train. Travel is a long, arduous, deeply uncomfortable and often incredibly dangerous undertaking. Forget your GPS and your comfy neck pillow, you're in for a rough ride. Your main options for overland travel are on foot or on horseback, or perhaps by mule or donkey, if you're slightly better off than a simple walker. If you're transporting goods, you'll be using pack animals or slow, cumbersome wagons pulled by oxen or horses. Roads, where they exist, are a far cry from modern paved highways. It's a historical fact that many medieval roads were simply unmaintained remnants of the old Roman road system, or little more than dirt tracks that turned into impassable muddy bogs after rain. They were often poorly marked, deeply rutted, and in hilly or mountainous terrain, treacherous. Imagine trying to navigate a heavy wagon over a narrow winding path with a steep drop on one side. Breakdowns were common, and repairs had to be made on the spot with whatever tools and materials you had at hand. Speed? Forget about it. If you're walking, you might cover 15 to 20 miles on a good day, if you're fit and the weather is kind. On horseback, you might manage 20 to 30 miles. A heavy wagon would be lucky to make 10 miles. A journey that takes a few hours by car today could take you days, weeks, or even months. You're constantly exposed to the elements. Scorching sun in summer, freezing rain and snow in winter. Shelter is not guaranteed. And then there are the dangers. The roads are not policed. Bandits and outlaws are a very real threat, especially in forested areas or remote mountain passes. These aren't charming Robin Hood figures. They're desperate men who wouldn't hesitate to rob you, beat you, or worse. A quirky and rather practical tidbit for medieval travellers was the advice to travel in groups for safety. Merchants would form armed caravans and pilgrims would often band together. Travelling alone was an invitation for trouble. You'd be wise to be armed yourself, even with a simple staff or knife, though that might not be much use against a determined group of robbers. You'd also have to worry about tolls. Many local lords and towns charge tolls for using roads or bridges, often in a terrible state of repair despite the fees that pass through their lands. These could add up significantly, eating into any profit a merchant might hope to make, or depleting a pilgrim's meagre funds. Finding accommodation for the night is another challenge. If you're lucky, you might find an inn or a tavern in a town or along a major route. But don't expect a travelodge. Medieval inns were often basic, crowded, and not particularly clean. You might have to share a room, or even a bed, with several strangers. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs would be your unwelcome sleeping companions. Remember those from your itchy attire? The food would be whatever the innkeeper was serving, likely that familiar friend pottage, and the ale might be watered down. If you couldn't find or afford an inn, you might seek shelter in a monastery as they often provided, hospitality to travellers. Failing that, you're sleeping rough, under a tree in a barn if you can find a cooperative farmer, or huddled by the side of the road. This, of course, makes you even more vulnerable to robbers and the elements. Water travel by river or sea was an alternative for some journeys, and often faster for transporting bulky goods. However, it came with its own set of perils. Riverboats could be subject to strong currents, hidden snags, or sudden floods. Sea voyages were at the mercy of the weather. Historians still argue about the reliability and safety of medieval shipping, but shipwrecks were terrifyingly common. Navigation was rudimentary, relying on landmarks, sounding lines, and basic knowledge of currents and stars. The compass was gradually adopted during the later Middle Ages, but it wasn't foolproof. Storms could blow ships drastically off course, or sink them entirely. And then there were pirates. Yes, pirates were a menace not just in the Caribbean centuries later, but also in waters like the Mediterranean, the North Sea and the English Channel. A merchant ship laden with valuable cargo, or even a pilgrim ship, was a tempting target. Capture could mean losing your goods, being held for ransom, or being sold into slavery. Imagine you're a pilgrim, vowed to visit the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, in northwestern Spain, starting from, say, England. This is a journey of over 1,000 miles, much of it on foot. You'd cross the English Channel, a perilous sea voyage in itself, then trudge through France, over the Pyrenees Mountains, a daunting obstacle, especially in bad weather, and across northern Spain. The journey could take months, each way. You'd face language barriers, unfamiliar customs, the constant threat of sickness. Remember, medical care is abysmal everywhere, exhaustion, and all the dangers of the road. Yet hundreds of thousands of people undertook such pilgrimages, driven by faith, the hope of a miracle, or the need to do penance. Their determination is astonishing, but the hardship they endured is almost unimaginable. One can only imagine the relief upon finally reaching the shrine, quickly followed by the dawning horror of, oh wait, I have to walk all the way back now? Even a short journey, say from your village to the nearest market town a dozen miles away, isn't a casual outing. It requires planning. You need to consider the weather, the state of the tracks, whether you'll be back before dark, travelling at night was exceptionally dangerous, and whether you can afford any tolls. You'd probably pack some bread and cheese, fill a water skin, and hope for the best. Crossing a swollen river without a bridge might mean wading through cold, fast-flowing water, or paying a ferryman an exorbitant fee. Every journey is an adventure, but not necessarily the fun kind. It's the kind where you're genuinely relieved to arrive at your destination in one piece, with your belongings and your life intact. You'd probably kiss the ground, if it wasn't so likely to be covered in something unpleasant we discussed earlier. You've braved the treacherous journey, perhaps arriving in a new town or, more likely, returning to your familiar, if somewhat odorous, surroundings. Whether you're a peasant in a rural village or an artisan in a bustling and filthy town, the place you call home is unlikely to bear much resemblance to the comfortable, climate-controlled, well-lit dwellings we take for granted today. Your medieval house is more of a hovel than a home, likely dark, smoky, cold in winter, stuffy in summer, and very, very crowded. Forget open-plan living and ensuite bathrooms. You're looking at basic and often quite grim shelter. Let's start with the typical peasant dwelling in the countryside. This would usually be a small 1 or 2 room cottage, often constructed using a timber frame with wattle and daub infill. Wattle and daub involved weaving flexible wooden branches, wattle through upright posts, and then smearing the gaps with a sticky mixture of clay, mud, dung and straw. Daub? It sounds rustic, and it was, but it wasn't particularly durable or weatherproof. The daub would crack and crumble, letting in drafts and damp. The roof would likely be thatched with straw or reeds. Thatch earth? Simple as that. It would be uneven, dusty when dry, and damp or muddy when wet. Rushes or straw might be strewn on the floor for a bit of insulation, and to absorb some of the grime, but it's a historical fact that these floor coverings were rarely changed, accumulating layers of food scraps, spills, animal droppings, if animals were brought inside, and general filth. This created an unhygienic environment, perfect for breeding bacteria and attracting pests. Just imagine the smell after a few months without a good mucking out. Windows, if they existed at all, would be small unglazed openings, perhaps covered with wooden shutters, oiled parchment, or cloth to keep out the worst of the weather. This meant that even during the day the interior of the cottage would be very dark. Glass was an expensive luxury, mostly reserved for churches or the homes of the very wealthy. So, you're living in perpetual twilight indoors. The central feature of your one-room hovel would be the hearth, an open fire in the middle of the floor or against one wall. This was essential for cooking and providing warmth. However, chimneys were not common in peasant homes until much later in the Middle Ages. A quirky and rather cough-inducing tidbit is that smoke from the open hearth would simply find its way out through a hole in the roof, or through the gaps in the walls and thatch. This meant the interior was constantly filled with acrid wood smoke stinging your eyes, coating everything with a layer of soot, and leading to chronic respiratory problems. It's a bit like living permanently in a poorly ventilated barbecue pit. Furniture would be sparse and crudely made. A rough wooden table, a few benches or stools, perhaps a chest for storing your meagre belongings. Beds, if you had them, might be simple wooden frames with straw-filled mattresses, which would also harbour fleas and lice. Often the whole family would sleep together in one bed or on piles of straw on the floor for warmth, offering zero privacy. And remember, in colder weather, it wasn't uncommon for families to bring their livestock, a pig, some chickens, maybe even a calf, inside at night to protect them from theft and the cold, and to benefit from their body heat. So you're snuggled up with your spouse, 3 kids, the family pig, and a symphony of snores, grunts, and the constant itch of your woolen blankets and unseen insect companions. Romantic, isn't it? If you lived in a town, your dwelling might be slightly different, but not necessarily much better. Houses were built close together, often sharing walls. Timber frame construction was common here too, sometimes with upper stories that jettied out over the street below, as we've discussed. This maximised living space, but made the streets dark and narrow. Fire was an enormous risk in these densely packed wooden towns. A blaze starting in one house could quickly spread and destroy entire neighbourhoods. Inside a townsperson's house, if they were an artisan or a small merchant, they might have a bit more space, perhaps a workshop or shop on the ground floor and living quarters above. There might be more furniture, and possibly even some glazed windows if they were moderately prosperous. However, overcrowding was still common, especially for apprentices or servants who might sleep in the workshop or kitchen. Sanitation remained a major issue. Chamber pots were used and then emptied into the street or a nearby cesspit if one existed. Running water indoors was an unimaginable luxury for all but the fabulously wealthy. You'd fetch your water from a public well or fountain, which, as we know, could be dangerously contaminated. Historians still argue about the general health impacts of urban versus rural living in the Middle Ages, with towns offering some economic advantages but often suffering from worse sanitation and higher disease rates due to population density. Heating in townhouses might involve fireplaces with rudimentary chimneys, which was an improvement over the open hearth, but fuel, wood or charcoal, could be expensive. The pervasive smell of smoke mixed with the general miasma from the streets would still be your constant companion. Privacy? Largely non-existent. In a one-room peasant hovel, every activity, cooking, eating, sleeping, birth, illness, death, happened in the same shared space. Even in slightly larger townhouses, walls were thin, and households were often bustling with family members, apprentices, and servants. The modern notion of personal space would be utterly alien. So your home is not a sanctuary of cleanliness and comfort. It's dark, smoky, probably damp, and shared with numerous other beings, both human and animal, and insect. It offers basic shelter from the elements, but it's also a breeding ground for disease and discomfort. You'd spend as much time outdoors as possible, not because you're a nature lover, but because the air quality inside is probably worse. When you think of home sweet home, you're probably not picturing a soot-stained, flea-infested one-room hut where the pig is snoring louder than your spouse. It makes that slightly leaky faucet or the draft from your window seem like trivial inconveniences, doesn't it? You're living in your dark, smoky, and probably rather crowded hovel, sharing your space with family, livestock, and a multitude of tiny uninvited guests. Now, what are you wearing while you endure all this medieval charm? If you're envisioning yourself swanning about in elegant velvet robes or practical, comfortable cotton, you might need to adjust your mental image. For most people in the Middle Ages, clothing was coarse, itchy, rarely washed, and quite possibly bug-infested. Fashion, for the common person, was less about style and more about basic functionality and durability, with a hefty dose of discomfort thrown in. The primary fabrics available to the vast majority of the population were wool and linen. Cotton was an expensive import, and silk was strictly the preserve of the very wealthy nobility and high clergy. So, wool is your go-to. Now, this isn't the soft merino wool you might find in a fancy sweater today. Medieval wool was often coarse, shorn from sheep that were not bred for fine fleeces. It would be spun by hand, a constant task for women, remember, often unevenly, and then woven into rough, heavy cloth. This woolen fabric would be durable, yes, and reasonably warm when dry, but also incredibly itchy against the skin. Imagine wearing a Brillo pad as an undershirt. That's the kind of sensory experience we're talking about. Linen, made from the flax plant, was used for undergarments, if you could afford them or had the time to make them, shirts, and coifs, head coverings. Linen was smoother than wool and more comfortable against the skin, but producing it was a laborious process. From cultivating and harvesting the flax to retting, soaking to separate the fibres, scutching, beating to remove woody parts, heckling, combing, spinning, and weaving. While more comfortable, linen still wasn't as soft as modern processed fabrics. Your basic outfit, if you're a peasant man, would consist of a linen shirt, if you're lucky, and brays, loose linen undertrousers, a bit like baggy shorts, covered by a woolen tunic, probably knee-length or longer, belted at the waist. On your legs, you might wear chausses, which were like separate leggings, sometimes with feet, tied to your brays or belt. Outer garments for warmth would include a woolen cloak or mantle. For women, the basic ensemble was a long linen chemise, a sort of shift or underdress, reaching to the ankles, over which you'd wear one or more woolen tunics or gowns, also long and belted. Married women, and often unmarried adult women, would almost always wear some form of head covering, like a wimple, veil, or coif. Going bareheaded in public was often considered improper. Colours would be mostly muted and drab. It's a historical fact that dyeing fabric was a complex and often expensive process, with vibrant lasting colours like true reds, purples and deep blues being particularly costly and therefore reserved for the wealthy. Your clothes would likely be the natural colours of wool, shades of white, grey, brown, black, or dyed with cheaper, locally available plant-based dyes, resulting in earthy tones like yellows, greens and russets. These dyes often faded quickly and could be uneven. That brilliant scarlet cloak you see on the knight, that cost a fortune, probably derived from Kermes insects. Your muddy brown tunic, that came from boiled walnut husks. And cleanliness? Oh dear. Washing clothes was a major undertaking. There are no washing machines, no convenient laundry detergents. Water had to be hauled, often from a distance, and heated over a fire. Soap, such as it was, often a harsh mixture of animal fat and wood ash, was not always readily available or effective. Clothes were heavy, especially wool when wet, and took a long time to dry, especially in damp medieval dwellings. A quirky and rather pungent tidbit is that people generally owned very few sets of clothes, perhaps one or two working outfits, and maybe something slightly better for church or special occasions. This meant garments were worn for long periods between washes, if they were washed thoroughly at all. More often, they might be brushed, aired out, which, given the air quality, might not help much, or spot cleaned. Undergarments like linen shirts and chemises would be washed more frequently than outer woolen garments, as they absorb the sweat and grime from the body. But frequently is a relative term. This infrequent washing, combined with the nature of the fabrics and close living quarters, often shared with animals, meant that clothing was an ideal habitat for fleas, lice, and other biting insects. That constant itch we mentioned earlier, your clothes are a major contributor. Imagine trying to sleep or work with a persistent army of tiny tormentors feasting on you. Delousing oneself or others would have been a regular and rather unpleasant pastime. What about footwear? If you're a peasant, you might go barefoot much of the time, especially in warmer weather. Otherwise, you'd wear simple leather shoes or boots, or perhaps wooden clogs, pattens, to raise your feet out of the mud and muck of the streets or fields. These shoes would be handmade, often ill-fitting, and prone to wearing out quickly. Socks or hosen made of cloth might be worn, but they too would be coarse and subject to the same hygiene issues. Children often wore smaller versions of adult clothing, or even simpler shifts and tunics. There wasn't a distinct concept of children's fashion. They were dressed for practicality, and clothes would be handed down and patched repeatedly until they literally fell apart. Making new clothes was too labour-intensive and materials too precious to do otherwise. Historians still argue about the exact level of personal comfort and the importance placed on cleanliness by medieval people. While some argue that standards were simply different, and people were accustomed to a level of grubbiness that would horrify us, others point to evidence of efforts to maintain hygiene within the limitations of the time. However, there's no denying that compared to modern standards you'd feel perpetually grimy and itchy. So, you're trudging through your day in your heavy, coarse, probably lice-infested woolen tunic that hasn't seen a proper wash in weeks, if not months. It smells faintly of wood smoke, stale sweat, and whatever unfortunate substances you've brushed against in the street or field. It's either too hot or not warm enough. You're constantly scratching. It's a far cry from your breathable, machine-washable, comfortable, modern wardrobe. You'd probably trade your entire kingdom, if you had one, for a pair of clean cotton socks and a washing machine, and you'd certainly never complain about laundry day again. The sheer relief of putting on truly clean clothes would be a luxury almost beyond imagining for most people in this era. Alright, so you've survived another long day of back-breaking labour, dressed in your itchy, rarely washed woolens, after a meal of questionable pottage in your smoky, crowded hovel. Surely there must be some way to unwind, some form of entertainment to briefly escape the relentless grind of medieval life. Well, yes, there was entertainment, but forget Netflix binges, immersive video games, or even a trip to the cinema. Amusements in the Middle Ages were generally simple, often crude, community-focused, and offered little in the way of genuine, comfortable escape. Your leisure time, if you even had much, would be filled with activities that might seem rather bleak or basic by today's standards. For the vast majority of the peasant class, leisure time was scarce. The agricultural calendar dictated life, and work was dawn to dusk for much of the year. However, there were breaks, primarily religious holidays. It's a historical fact that the church calendar, with its numerous saints' days and festivals like Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun, provided the main opportunities for collective time off. These were not just solemn religious observances, they were also occasions for feasting, as much as your meagre resources allowed, drinking ale, dancing, singing, and communal games. What kind of games? Think less organised sports with official rules and safety equipment, and more rough-and-tumble activities that could easily result in injury. Wrestling was popular. Archery contests were common, especially in England where the longbow was a vital military tool. Various forms of folk football, often played between entire villages, were widespread. These games were notoriously violent, with few rules, huge numbers of players, and the goal sometimes being miles apart. Broken bones were practically part of the fun. It's a bit like a rugby scrum mixed with a small riot, all in the name of village pride. You definitely wouldn't want to be the ball. Music and dancing were integral to these celebrations. Minstrels and travelling musicians might appear, playing pipes, fiddles, drums and bagpipes. Yes, bagpipes were not just Scottish. People would dance in circles or lines, often with great enthusiasm, if not always refined skill. Storytelling was another key form of entertainment, especially given the widespread illiteracy. People would gather to hear traditional folk tales, legends of heroes, saints' lives, or bawdy comic stories. A good storyteller could hold an audience captive for hours, painting vivid pictures with words in a world largely devoid of visual mass media. In towns and cities, guilds might put on plays, especially mystery plays depicting biblical stories, often performed on pageant wagons in the streets. These could be elaborate productions with colourful costumes and special effects, like demons emerging from a smoking hellmouth, and were a major source of entertainment and religious instruction for the urban populace. Travelling, troops of actors, acrobats, jugglers, and animal trainers also made their rounds, performing at fairs and markets. A quirky and sometimes unsettling tidbit is the popularity of animal entertainments like bear baiting or cockfighting. These brutal spectacles, where animals were forced to fight each other or were set upon by dogs, were considered exciting diversions by many. It's a stark reminder of the different sensibilities regarding animal welfare. Your local Peter representative would have had a complete meltdown. Taverns and alehouses were central social hubs, places where people gathered after work to drink ale. Remember, often safer than water, play dice games, gambling was rife, exchange news and gossip, and perhaps sing a song or two. These establishments could be lively but also rowdy and prone to brawls. For the nobility, leisure activities were more refined, or at least more expensive. Hunting with hounds and hawks was a favourite pastime, both for sport and for supplementing the aristocratic table with game. Tournaments were grand spectacles, where knights could display their martial prowess in jousts and mock battles, though injuries and even deaths were not uncommon. Feasting in the Great Hall with multiple courses, wine and entertainment from minstrels, jesters and poets was a regular feature of noble life. They also enjoyed games like chess, which had arrived from the East, backgammon, and various dice and card games, as cards became more common in the later Middle Ages. Noblewomen might engage in needlework, embroidery, reading romances, playing musical instruments, or dancing. Historians still argue about the true nature and extent of leisure for the common medieval person, given the overwhelming demands of labour and the intertwining of religious observance with free time. Was it truly free time, or just a different kind of communal obligation? Regardless, these moments of respite were crucial for social cohesion and psychological well-being in a harsh world. However, even these simple amusements were often a far cry from genuine relaxation, or escape in the modern sense. There's no comfortable sofa to sink into, no private screen to lose yourself in. Entertainment is public, often boisterous, and sometimes carries its own risks, whether it's a broken leg from a village football game or losing your week's earnings in a dice game. The fun is often tinged with the same roughness and lack of refinement that characterised other aspects of medieval life. Imagine your idea of a relaxing evening being to stand in a muddy field drinking lukewarm ale and watching two dogs try to savage a chained bear. It really puts your boring Tuesday night into perspective. And for children, play certainly existed, but as we've seen, childhood was short, and they were integrated into adult work early. Their toys were simple: carved wooden animals, dolls made of rags or wood, spinning tops, balls. They would mimic adult activities in their play, and much of their leisure would be spent alongside adults, observing or participating in communal festivities. There wasn't a vast commercial industry churning out toys and games specifically for children, so while life wasn't all unremitting gloom and toil, your options for blowing off steam were limited and often lacked the comfort, safety, or sophisticated escapism we associate with modern leisure. It was about finding joy in simple, shared experiences, enduring the rough edges, and being grateful for any brief interlude from the daily grind. You'd look forward to the next Saint's Day with an almost desperate fervour, not just for the spiritual uplift, but for the chance to forget, just for a little while, how incredibly hard your life really was. All right, so you've survived another long day of back-breaking labour, dressed in your itchy, rarely washed woolens, after a meal of questionable pottage in your smoky, crowded hovel. Surely there must be some way to unwind, some form of entertainment to briefly escape the relentless grind of medieval life? Well, yes, there was entertainment, but forget Netflix binges, immersive video games, or even a trip to the cinema. Amusements in the Middle Ages were generally simple, often crude, community-focused, and offered little in the way of genuine, comfortable escape. Your leisure time, if you even had much, would be filled with activities that might seem rather bleak or basic by today's standards. For the vast majority, the peasant class, leisure time was scarce. The agricultural calendar dictated life, and work was dawn to dusk for much of the year. However, there were breaks, primarily religious holidays. It's a historical fact that the church calendar, with its numerous saints' days and festivals like Christmas, Easter and Whitsun, provided the main opportunities for collective time off. These were not just solemn religious observances, they were also occasions for feasting, as much as your meagre resources allowed, drinking ale, dancing, singing and communal games. What kind of games? Think less, organised sports with official rules and safety equipment, and more rough and tumble activities that could easily result in injury. Wrestling was popular. Archery contests were common, especially in England, where the longbow was a vital military tool. Various forms of folk football, often played between entire villages, were widespread. These games were notoriously violent, with few rules, huge numbers of players, and the goal sometimes being miles apart. Broken bones were practically part of the fun. It's a bit like a rugby scrum mixed with a small riot, all in the name of village pride. You definitely wouldn't want to be the ball. Music and dancing were integral to these celebrations. Minstrels and travelling musicians might appear, playing pipes, fiddles, drums and bagpipes. Yes, bagpipes were not just Scottish. People would dance in circles or lines, often with great enthusiasm, if not always refined skill. Storytelling was another key form of entertainment, especially given the widespread illiteracy. People would gather to hear traditional folk tales, legends of heroes, saints' lives, or bawdy comic stories. A good storyteller could hold an audience captive for hours, painting vivid pictures with words in a world largely devoid of visual mass media. In towns and cities, guilds might put on plays, especially mystery plays depicting biblical stories, often performed on pageant wagons in the streets. These could be elaborate productions with colourful costumes and special effects, like demons emerging from a smoking hell mouth, and were a major source of entertainment and religious instruction for the urban populace. Travelling troupes of actors, acrobats, jugglers and animal trainers also made their rounds, performing at fairs and markets. A quirky, and sometimes unsettling tidbit is the popularity of animal entertainments like bear baiting or cockfighting. These brutal spectacles where animals were forced to fight each other or were set upon by dogs were considered exciting diversions by many. It's a stark reminder of the different sensibilities regarding animal welfare. Your local PETA representative would have had a complete meltdown. Taverns and alehouses were central social hubs, places where people gathered after work to drink ale, remember often safer than water, play dice games, gambling was rife, exchange news and gossip, and perhaps sing a song or two. These establishments could be lively, but also rowdy and prone to brawls. For the nobility, leisure activities were more refined, or at least more expensive. Hunting with hounds and hawks was a favourite pastime, both for sport and for supplementing the aristocratic table with game. Tournaments were grand spectacles, where knights could display their martial prowess in jousts and mock battles, though injuries and even deaths were not uncommon. Feasting in the Great Hall with multiple courses, wine and entertainment from minstrels, jesters and poets was a regular feature of noble life. They also enjoyed games like chess, which had arrived from the East, backgammon and various dice and card games as cards became more common in the later Middle Ages. Noble women might engage in needlework, embroidery, reading romances, playing musical instruments or dancing. Historians still argue about the true nature and extent of leisure for the common medieval person, given the overwhelming demands of labour and the intertwining of religious observance with free time. Was it truly free time, or just a different kind of communal obligation? Regardless, these moments of respite were crucial for social cohesion and psychological well-being in a harsh world. However, even these simple amusements were often a far cry from genuine relaxation or escape in the modern sense. There's no comfortable sofa to sink into, no private screen to lose yourself in. Entertainment is public, often boisterous, and sometimes carries its own risks, whether it's a broken leg from a village football game or losing your week's earnings in a dice game. The fun is often tinged with the same roughness and lack of refinement that characterised other aspects of medieval life. Imagine your idea of a relaxing evening being to stand in a muddy field drinking lukewarm ale and watching two dogs try to savage a chained bear. It really puts your boring Tuesday night into perspective. And for children, play certainly existed, but as we've seen, childhood was short and they were integrated into adult work early. Their toys were simple: carved wooden animals, dolls made of rags or wood, spinning tops, balls. They would mimic adult activities in their play, and much of their leisure would be spent alongside adults, observing or participating in communal festivities. There wasn't a vast commercial industry churning out toys and games specifically for children. So, while life wasn't all unremitting gloom and toil, your options for blowing off steam were limited and often lacked the comfort, safety, or sophisticated escapism we associate with modern leisure. It was about finding joy in simple, shared experiences, enduring the rough edges, and being grateful for any brief interlude from the daily grind. You'd look forward to the next saint's day with an almost desperate fervour, not just for the spiritual uplift, but for the chance to forget just for a little while how incredibly hard your life really was. You've enjoyed your brief, probably rather boisterous period of medieval leisure, perhaps a village dance or a raucous game of something vaguely resembling football. Now it's back to the daily grind. And as you navigate your world, whether you're trying to understand your feudal obligations, decipher a market sign, if such a thing even exists and you can read it, or simply make sense of the broader world beyond your immediate village, you'll be confronted by a profound and pervasive reality, widespread ignorance and limited access to knowledge. For most people in the Middle Ages, reading is a rare and mysterious skill, and most information is transmitted orally, subject to all the inaccuracies and limitations that entails. Formal education, as we've touched upon, was the preserve of a tiny elite. It's a historical fact that literacy was overwhelmingly concentrated within the clergy. Monks and priests needed to read Latin for religious services, theological study, and administrative tasks. Cathedrals and monasteries often had schools attached to them, primarily for training future clerics. Some larger towns also had grammar schools. Universities began to emerge from the 11th century onwards. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. But these were for training theologians, lawyers and physicians, and their student bodies were exclusively male and drawn largely from the gentry, or those with clerical ambitions. For the average peasant or artisan, the idea of attending such an institution was as fantastical as flying to the moon. So if you're a typical medieval person, you cannot read or write. This has profound implications. You're reliant on others, the local priest, a travelling merchant, a clerk, to read any written documents to you, whether it's a legal deed, a royal proclamation or a letter. You cannot independently verify what they tell you. This creates a huge power imbalance. Knowledge is power, and in a largely illiterate society, those who can read and write hold a significant advantage. Imagine trying to understand a contract for your land rental when you can't read the words on the parchment, and the Lord Steward is explaining it to you. You just have to trust him, don't you? Or more likely, you just nod along because you have no other choice. Your understanding of the world, of history, of science, of geography, is shaped by what you hear, not what you read. Information is passed down through stories, songs, sermons, and local gossip. This oral tradition is rich and vital, but it's also prone to distortion, embellishment, and the forgetting or misremembering of facts over time. News from distant lands travels slowly, often by word of mouth, becoming more and more garbled with each retelling. Think of a game of telephone played across continents and decades. What starts as a fairly accurate account of a battle in a faraway kingdom might reach your village as a fantastical tale of dragons and sorcerers. Your knowledge of geography is likely limited to your immediate surroundings, your village, the nearby forest, the closest market town. The wider world is a vague and mysterious place, populated by strange peoples and mythical beasts, based on travellers' tales that may or may not be accurate. Maps existed, but they were rare, expensive, and often more symbolic or theological than geographically precise. The famous Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, for instance, places Jerusalem at the centre of the world and includes depictions of monstrous races in distant lands. A quirky and revealing tidbit is that many medieval maps were oriented with east at the top, where paradise was believed to be, which is why we still use the term to orient, literally to face east. Scientific understanding is based largely on ancient authorities like Aristotle and Galen, whose works were often interpreted through a theological lens. The natural world is full of wonders, but also portents and signs from God. A comet is not just a celestial body. It's a harbinger of doom or great events. Sickness is not just caused by pathogens, a concept centuries away. It's a result of humoral imbalance, divine punishment, or even witchcraft. There's little concept of empirical investigation or the scientific method as we know it. Historians still argue about the extent to which genuine scientific inquiry was stifled by religious dogma during the Middle Ages, with some pointing to periods of intellectual stagnation, while others highlight important innovations and the preservation of classical knowledge, particularly in monastic centres and later in universities. Access to books. Forget it. Before the invention of the printing press, a late medieval innovation that took time to become widespread, books were handwritten manuscripts, painstakingly copied by scribes onto expensive parchment, made from animal skin. A single book could take months or even years to produce, and could cost as much as a house. They were precious objects found only in monastic libraries, royal courts, or the homes of the very wealthy. The idea of a personal library or even just owning a few books was unthinkable for the average person. Your library is the memory of your community and the images in your church. This lack of widespread literacy and access to information means that critical thinking and questioning of authority are not widely encouraged or easily practiced. You accept what you're told by those in positions of power or religious authority because you have little basis for challenging it. Superstition and rumour can spread like wildfire, unchallenged by verifiable facts or reasoned debate. It's a world where "I read it on the internet" is replaced by "Old man Hemlock heard it from a one-eyed peddler who got it from a pilgrim who swore it was true" seems legit. So, you live in a state of informational twilight. Your world is smaller, more mysterious, and more governed by tradition and authority than by accessible, verifiable knowledge. While this doesn't mean people were unintelligent, They possessed vast amounts of practical knowledge necessary for survival in their specific environments. Their intellectual horizons were necessarily limited by the tools available to them. You might be incredibly skilled at farming, or weaving, or blacksmithing, but your understanding of why the seasons change, or what lies beyond the next mountain range, or the true causes of disease, would be very different and much more constrained than ours. You'd look up at the stars and see not galaxies and nebulae, but the floor of heaven, pricked with holes to let the divine light shine through, and you wouldn't have a pesky science textbook to tell you otherwise. You're navigating your life in this world of limited knowledge, where superstition often trumps science, and where daily survival is a constant struggle against hunger, disease, and the elements. But lurking in the background, an ever-present and utterly terrifying possibility, is a threat so devastating it could wipe out entire communities, reshape societies, and instill a level of dread that's hard for us to comprehend today. This is the shadow of the plague, particularly the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century and recurred in outbreaks for centuries thereafter. Its arrival means your already precarious existence is about to become a desperate fight against an invisible, indiscriminate, and appallingly lethal enemy. The Black Death, which reached Europe around 1347, was most likely bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It's a historical fact that this devastating pandemic is estimated to have killed between 30% and 60% of Europe's population in just a few years, tens of millions of people. Imagine a catastrophe on that scale today. It's almost unimaginable. The disease was primarily spread by fleas carried on black rats, which were ubiquitous in the unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and villages. Remember those street cesspools and cosy vermin-filled homes? Once a human was bitten by an infected flea, the disease progressed with terrifying speed. The symptoms were horrific. First, fever, chills, and vomiting. Then, the telltale sign, the appearance of buboes, painfully swollen lymph nodes, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck, which could grow to the size of an apple and often turned black as the tissue died. This is where the name Black Death comes from. Sufferers would experience extreme pain, delirium, and often internal bleeding, leading to dark patches on the skin. Death usually followed within 2 to 7 days of the first symptoms. There was also a pneumonic form of the plague, spread by airborne droplets from coughing, which was even more virulent and almost invariably fatal, often within 24 to 48 hours, and a septicemic form, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing rapid death, sometimes before buboes even had a chance to form. When the plague arrived in your community, it would spread like wildfire. People had no understanding of germ theory or how the disease was transmitted. Explanations abounded, most of them rooted in fear and superstition. Some believed it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins. Others blamed miasma, bad air, or poisonous vapours rising from the earth or swamps. A quirky and tragically misguided contemporary belief was that the plague could be caused by unfavourable astrological alignments, or even by looking an infected person in the eye. Consequently, remedies were often useless or even harmful. People tried fleeing infected areas, but this often just spread the disease further. They burned aromatic herbs to purify the air, wore amulets, prayed, and made penitential processions. Physicians with their humoral theories were helpless. Bloodletting a plague victim? Probably not a good idea. The social fabric would begin to unravel. Fear and panic became rampant. Historians still argue about the precise psychological impact on survivors, but contemporary accounts describe a breakdown of normal human bonds. People abandoned sick family members, priests refused to administer last rites, and doctors fled. The sheer number of dead was overwhelming. Mass graves had to be dug to accommodate the bodies. In some places, so many died so quickly that there was no one left to bury them, and bodies were left in houses or in the streets. Imagine the horror of watching your family, your friends, your entire village succumb one by one, knowing that you could be next, and that there is nothing you can do to stop it. The economic consequences were also profound. With so many workers dying, fields went unploughed, harvests rotted, and crafts and trades ground to a halt. This led to labour shortages, And ironically, for those peasants who survived, it sometimes meant improved bargaining power. Landlords, desperate for workers, were forced to offer better wages or conditions. This has led some historians to see the Black Death as a catalyst for long-term social and economic change, contributing to the decline of serfdom in some areas. But in the short term, it meant disruption, famine, and economic chaos. Religious responses were varied. Some turned to intense piety, flagellating themselves in public processions to atone for the sins they believed had brought God's wrath. Others, seeing the apparent randomness with which the plague struck down both the righteous and the wicked, lost faith or indulged in hedonistic eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die behaviour. Scapegoating was also common. Minority groups, particularly Jews, were often baselessly accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the plague. This led to horrific massacres and persecutions in many parts of Europe. Even if you survived an initial outbreak, the plague didn't just disappear, it became endemic, returning in smaller, localized epidemics every few years or decades for centuries. So the fear of its return was a constant presence, a dark cloud hanging over medieval life. Every unexplained fever, every swollen gland would spark terror. You'd live with the knowledge that at any moment this invisible killer could reappear and decimate your community once more. It's hard to overstate the psychological burden of such an existence. You'd be praying not just for a good harvest or safety from bandits, but for deliverance from an enemy you couldn't see, understand, or fight. Your world would feel incredibly fragile, your life a flickering candle in a storm. The only social distancing you might practice is running away as fast as possible, which ironically was probably one of the few slightly effective if selfish measures. And you'd certainly look at rats with a whole new level of animosity, if that were even possible given your already vermin-infested home. The Black Death has, perhaps, receded for now, leaving a trail of devastation and a lingering, deep-seated fear in its wake. But even without a full-blown epidemic raging, your medieval mind is far from at peace. Your world is not just populated by visible dangers like famine, war, and disease. It's also teeming with unseen forces, malevolent entities, and a pervasive sense of superstitious dread that colours your every thought and action. You live in constant, fearful caution, dictated by a complex web of beliefs about demons, witches, bad omens, and the ever-present possibility of supernatural interference in your daily life. For you, the medieval commoner, the spiritual realm is not an abstract concept. It's an immediate and tangible reality. God and the saints are powerful forces for good, but their counterparts, Satan and his legions of demons, are equally real and actively working to corrupt souls and wreak havoc in the world. It's a historical fact that belief in demons and their ability to influence human affairs was widespread and officially sanctioned by the Church. Demons were thought to cause illness, accidents, bad weather, like hailstorms that destroyed crops, and to tempt people into sin. Every unexplained misfortune, every dark thought, every strange noise in the night could be attributed to demonic activity. This belief system fosters a constant state of vigilance and anxiety. You're always on the lookout for signs of demonic presence or influence. A sudden illness in your livestock could be a demon, a child born with a deformity, perhaps a demon interfered, or it's a changeling, remember those. A bout of melancholy or disturbing dreams, demonic oppression. You'd rely on the Church for protection, prayer, sacraments, holy water, blessed objects like crucifixes and relics, but the fear would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. Then there's the fear of witches. While the large-scale witch hunts are more characteristic of the early modern period, the belief in witchcraft and malevolent magic was firmly established in the Middle Ages. Witches were believed to be individuals, usually women, who had made a pact with the devil in exchange for supernatural powers, which they used to harm others, causing impotence, blighting crops, making cows dry up, or bringing sickness and death. A quirky and rather disturbing tidbit is the medieval belief in storm witches, who were thought to be able to conjure storms by stirring water with a stick, or by other magical means. If a sudden tempest ruined the harvest, suspicion might fall on an unpopular local woman, particularly if she was old, poor, lived alone, or had a reputation for knowing about herbs, which could be misconstrued as potion-making. Accusations of witchcraft could arise from neighbourhood quarrels, personal grudges, or simply as a way to explain inexplicable misfortunes. Once accused, you were in terrible danger. As with heresy, trials for witchcraft could involve torture to extract confessions, and the punishment was often death, usually by burning. The fear of being accused or of being targeted by a witch's maleficium, evil spell, would make you very careful about your relationships with your neighbours and wary of anyone who seemed unusual or kept to themselves. You might employ counter-magic, lucky charms, amulets, specific rituals to protect yourself and your household, practices that often existed in a grey area between folk belief and what the church considered acceptable. Beyond demons and witches, your daily life is governed by a vast array of superstitions and omens. Spilling salt is bad luck. A black cat crossing your path, though in some places black cats were actually lucky, could be a good or bad sign depending on local tradition. The hooting of an owl at night, a dog howling inexplicably, a sudden clap of thunder from a clear sky. All these could be interpreted as portents of impending doom or significant events. Historians still argue about the extent to which these folk beliefs were genuinely integrated with, or existed in tension with, official church teachings. While the church condemned superstition, many of these beliefs were deeply ingrained in popular culture and were hard to eradicate. You'd be careful about certain days of the week or times of the year considered unlucky for starting new ventures, getting married, or undertaking journeys. You might have rituals for ensuring good luck in farming, such as blessing the plough or the seeds. The position of the moon, the behaviour of animals, even the way a fire burns, all could be scrutinised for hidden meanings. It's a world where nothing is truly random. Everything has a potential supernatural explanation. This constant superstitious dread adds another layer of stress to your already difficult life. You're not just worried about your crops failing due to drought. You're worried they might fail because your neighbour cursed your field, or because you forgot to perform the correct protective ritual at planting time. You're not just anxious about a sick child, you're terrified it might be the work of a demon or a witch. It's exhausting, this need to constantly interpret signs, appease unseen forces, and ward off malevolent influences. Imagine trying to make important decisions when you're constantly worried about offending some spirit or triggering a bad omen. Do I build my new shed here, or is this spot haunted? Should I marry this person, or is their family cursed? It's a mental burden that we, in our more secular and scientifically oriented age, can barely imagine. You'd be whispering prayers and crossing yourself at every shadow, every unexplained creak in your hovel. You might carry a pouch of protective herbs, or a special stone found in a holy place, hoping it will keep the bad luck at bay. It's like living in a perpetual low-grade horror movie, where the jump scares are less about sudden monsters and more about the dawning realization that your milk has curdled for no good reason, which, obviously, means old Mother Hemlock down the lane has put the evil eye on your cow again, and now you have to decide whether to confront her, report her to the priest, risky, or just try to counteract the spell with an even more potent, and probably equally superstitious remedy of your own. Good luck sleeping tonight. You've managed to navigate the labyrinth of superstitious dread, perhaps by meticulously observing all the local charms and rituals, and you're still here. But as the first pale light of dawn filters through the cracks in your wattle and daub walls, or through the single smoky hole in your thatched roof, it signals the start of another day defined by one overwhelming reality. Unceasing, exhausting, dawn to dusk toil that offers precious few rewards and truly never ever seems to end. Forget work-life balance, weekends off, or paid vacation. Your life is a relentless cycle of labour, dictated by the seasons, the demands of your lord, and the basic pressing need to simply survive. If you're a peasant, which is the most likely scenario, your workday begins before the sun is fully up. There's no gentle wake-up call from a smartphone alarm, no leisurely cup of coffee. You're roused by the crowing of the rooster, the stirring of your family, and possibly the pig in the corner, and the gnawing in your stomach reminding you that yesterday's meagre pottage is long gone. After a quick, probably cold, bite of stale bread, it's out to the fields. It's a historical fact that the agricultural calendar governed peasant life with an iron grip. Spring meant ploughing the heavy soil, often with a team of oxen that you might share with your neighbours, followed by sowing the precious seeds of wheat, barley, rye or oats. Summer was a constant battle against weeds. Remember your childhood job of hand weeding, tending the crops and haymaking, cutting, drying and storing hay for winter animal fodder, a hot and exhausting task. Autumn was the most critical period, harvest time. Everyone, men, women and children old enough to wield a sickle or gather fallen grain, would be in the fields from first light until darkness forced them to stop. The success of the harvest meant the difference between having enough food to survive the winter and facing starvation. The grain had to be cut, bundled, threshed, beating the grain from the stalks, often with flails, another back-breaking job, and then winnowed, tossing it in the air to let the wind blow away the chaff. A portion of this hard-won harvest, often a significant one, would then go to your lord as feudal dues, and another portion to the church as a tithe. What was left was yours, to be carefully stored and rationed. Winter brought a slight change of pace, but not necessarily rest. There was still livestock to feed and care for, tools to mend, firewood to chop and haul, a constant necessity for heating and cooking, fences to repair, and domestic tasks like spinning and weaving to occupy the darker days. And if the harvest had been poor, winter was a time of hunger, cold, and anxiety. The tools you're using are rudimentary and muscle-powered. Heavy wooden ploughs, iron-tipped if you're lucky, sickles, scythes, flails. There are no tractors, no combine harvesters. Every task requires immense physical exertion. Your body is your primary machine, and it's subject to constant strain, aches, and injuries. A twisted ankle, a strained back, a deep cut from a sharp tool. These aren't just inconveniences. They can be catastrophic if they prevent you from working, or if they become infected. Remember that lovely medieval medical care? If you're an artisan in a town, your workday is also long and grueling. A blacksmith starts at dawn, firing up the forge, and works late into the evening, the heat and noise relentless. A weaver sits at their loom for hours on end, the repetitive motion straining their eyes and back. A baker rises in the middle of the night to prepare dough and fire ovens. Apprentices and journeymen are under the constant supervision of the master craftsman, with long hours and often harsh discipline. A quirky, though telling detail, is that many guild regulations specified the length of the working day, often tying it to daylight hours, and sometimes even fined masters for working their apprentices too late by candlelight because it was a fire hazard and produced inferior work. But too late still meant a very, very long day. There are no weekends in the modern sense. Sunday is a day of rest from most labour, dedicated to church services, but it's not necessarily a day of leisure. And the numerous saints' days and religious festivals, while providing breaks from the usual toil, often came with their own obligations and activities. The concept of a 40-hour work week would be met with utter bafflement. You work when there is light to see, and when there is work to be done, which is almost always. And what are the rewards for this unceasing labour? For most, they are meagre. Enough food to keep you and your family alive if you're lucky and the harvest is good. Basic shelter in your smoky hovel, coarse clothing to keep out the cold. There's little surplus, little opportunity to accumulate wealth or improve your material circumstances, especially if you're a serf bound to the land and its obligations. You work not for personal advancement or fulfillment in the modern sense, but for sheer, unadorned survival. It's a life lived on the edge, where one bad harvest, one prolonged illness, or one destructive raid can push you over into destitution or starvation. Historians still argue about the average caloric intake and nutritional status of medieval peasants, but it's generally agreed that life for many was a constant struggle to secure enough food, and periods of acute hunger or even famine were recurrent. The monotony must have been soul-crushing. The same tasks day after day, year after year, with little variation and little hope for change. The physical exhaustion would be a constant companion, a dull ache in your muscles and bones that never truly goes away. You'd fall into your straw bed at night too tired to even dream, only to rise before dawn and do it all over again. There's no retirement age, no pension plan. You work until you're physically incapable, and then you become a burden on your family if you have one, or face neglect and destitution if you don't. It's a grim prospect. Imagine the sheer, bone-deep weariness of it all. It makes that slightly stressful day you had at the office, with its annoying emails and lukewarm coffee, seem like a delightful frolic in a field of daisies, doesn't it? At least your daisies probably aren't also being claimed by the local lord as part of his daisy tithe. You've toiled relentlessly from dawn till dusk, day after day, year after year. Your body, which has been your primary tool and constant companion in this struggle for survival, is starting to betray you. The unceasing labour, the meagre diet, the recurrent illnesses and the general harshness of medieval life have taken their toll. Growing old in the Middle Ages is not a gentle decline into a comfortable retirement, filled with hobbies and grandchildren. It's a rapid descent. Existed, particularly for those who could offer wisdom or who held positions of authority within the family or community. But this wasn't universal, and the practical realities of caring for an unproductive mouth could strain even the strongest familial bonds. And what about your appearance? Forget anti-aging creams or cosmetic surgery. The harsh sun and wind, poor nutrition, and dental decay would leave their marks. Skin would be wrinkled and leathery, hair thinned and greyed, if not lost entirely. You would look and feel much older than a person of the same chronological age today. A medieval 50-year-old might have the physical appearance and ailments of a modern 70 or 80-year-old. A quirky and rather poignant aspect of medieval attitudes towards aging can sometimes be seen in art and literature, where old age is occasionally depicted with a degree of reverence, but more often as a period of decline, ugliness, and regret. The Ages of Man motif often showed old age as the final sombre stage before death, characterized by physical decay and a turning towards spiritual concerns in preparation for the inevitable. So, your golden years are anything but. They are years of increasing pain, diminishing capacity and growing dependence. You watch as your contemporaries succumb to illness or accident. You reflect on a life of unrelenting toil, perhaps with a sense of resignation, or if you're lucky, some quiet satisfaction in having survived so long against the odds. But there's little comfort, little ease. The smoky hovel is still smoky, the pottage is still bland, and the nights are still cold. You are simply less able to cope with it all. Your world shrinks, your horizons narrow, and your thoughts turn increasingly towards the afterlife, which, given the hardships of this life, might seem like a welcome release or a terrifying judgment depending on your spiritual state. And when death finally comes, it's likely to be in that same crowded room where you were born, surrounded by the sights, sounds and smells that have defined your entire existence. A quiet, unremarked passing in a world that has already largely moved on without you. The gentle hum of the fan you might have on now, the soft glow of your dimmed lights, the very comfort of your bed. These are luxuries that your medieval counterpart, old and weary, could only dream of, if they even had the capacity to imagine such things. They are a stark reminder of how profoundly different and how profoundly difficult life was in that bygone era, especially as one approached its inevitable, often ungraceful end. And so, as our journey through the less than glamorous realities of medieval life draws to a close, hopefully you're feeling a renewed appreciation for your own warm bed, your clean water, and your surprisingly well-stocked pantry. We've walked those filthy streets together, tasted that questionable pottage, and perhaps even felt a phantom itch from those ever-present fleas. It's a world that, for all its tapestries and troubadours, was a daily struggle for survival against odds that seem almost insurmountable from our modern vantage point. The romantic sheen quickly fades when confronted with the starkness of infant mortality, the brutality of justice, or the ever-present shadow of the plague, into pain, widespread neglect, and, for most, an early demise by modern standards. Graceful aging is a luxury few can afford or experience. What does old even mean in this context? It's a historical fact that life expectancy in the Middle Ages was significantly lower than today. While figures vary by region, social class and period, a general estimate might put average life expectancy at birth somewhere in the 30s or early 40s. However, this low average is heavily skewed by the appallingly high rates of infant and child mortality we've discussed. If you survived the perils of childhood and early adulthood, disease, accidents, childbirth, warfare, you might live into your 50s, 60s or even beyond. But beyond was rare, and those who reached what we would consider old age were often exceptions, regarded with a mixture of respect for their accumulated wisdom and experience, and perhaps a little suspicion. Remember those old women accused of witchcraft. As your body ages, the cumulative effects of a lifetime of hard physical labour become undeniable. Your joints ache constantly from arthritis, your back is permanently stooped, your muscles are weakened. Years of working in poorly lit conditions or in the constant smoke of an open hearth have likely damaged your eyesight. Your teeth, if you have any left after encounters with gritty bread and medieval tooth pullers, are probably loose and painful. Chronic coughs from a lifetime of breathing smoky air or dust from threshing floors are common. Old injuries, poorly healed, flare up with renewed intensity. There are no effective painkillers beyond alcohol, or perhaps some herbal remedies that offer only fleeting relief. You just learn to live with constant low-grade, or sometimes high-grade, pain. Your ability to work diminishes. This is a critical issue in a society where your value is often directly tied to your productivity. If you're a peasant, you can no longer keep up with the pace of ploughing or harvesting. If you're an artisan, your failing eyesight or unsteady hands make it difficult to perform your craft. Historians still argue about the social support systems available for the elderly and infirm in the Middle Ages. For many, the primary source of support was their family. If you had adult children, they were generally expected to care for you in your old age, often within the same crowded household. This could be a loving arrangement, but it could also be a burden on a family already struggling to make ends meet. If you had no surviving children, or if your children were unable or unwilling to support you, your prospects were grim. Some religious institutions, like monasteries or hospitals, which were more like hospices or almshouses, did provide care for the elderly poor, but their resources were limited and couldn't meet the needs of everyone. Guilds might offer some support to their aged or infirm members, but for many, old age without family support meant destitution, begging, and a lonely, miserable end. The image of the bent-over old woman or man, huddled in rags and begging for alms by the church door, was a common one. There's no concept of retirement as we know it. You work as long as you physically can, and then you become dependent. This loss of independence and utility could be psychologically devastating. In a society that valued strength and productivity, becoming weak and reliant on others could lead to feelings of worthlessness and a loss of social standing. Respect for elders. As you drift off to sleep now, let the gentle cadence of these stories fade into the background. The hardships we've explored tonight belong to a distant past, a testament to the resilience of those who lived through them, but thankfully not a reality you need to face when you wake. Let your mind settle. Feel the comfort of your pillow, the security of your room. The night is quiet and you are safe. Those medieval anxieties, those fears of famine and plague can be put aside. Breathe deeply and allow yourself to relax completely, letting go of the day's concerns and sinking into a peaceful, restorative sleep. The world we visited tonight is just a story, and now it's time for your own sweet dreams.